18th Planning Commission meeting. I'd like to call this meeting to order. If everybody could please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you, everybody. Roll call, please.
Commissioner Bergman.
Present.
Commissioner Gutierrez.
Present.
Commissioner Marsters.
Present.
Vice Chair Silberman will be out tonight. Chair Harper Pedersen.
Present. Thank you. Public comment. Public comment is limited to items that are not on the posted agenda. Is anybody here tonight to speak on an item not on the posted agenda? Okay, seeing nobody and having no speaker cards for that, I will move on to the approval of the minutes. Approval of the February 18th minutes. Did the commissioners have any changes or additions to the February 18th minutes?
I didn't see any.
No, I thought they were fine as well. Okay, can I get a motion, please?
Move to approve the minutes from February 18th.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
I abstain.
And one abstention. Thank you. Okay, we will move on now to the public hearing. And because I see some new faces in the audience, I'm going to go through the procedure for the public hearing. The staff is going to present a report on the history, the physical features, et cetera, on the application, followed with the staff's recommendation. At that point, the applicant may make a presentation as well. Thereafter, interested members of the community may speak on the proposal. When all interested parties have had an opportunity to be heard, the hearing will be closed, and then the commission will discuss the item and make its recommendation. If you choose to challenge a public hearing item in court, you may be limited to raising only those issues that you or somebody else has raised during a public hearing or in written notice to the commission. Speakers should fill out a speaker's card, which is going to be located at the front, and pass them to staff if you're interested in speaking, and we will call you in order at that point. Thank you very much, everybody. And our first item is item A1087, Old County Road, consideration of design review, approval of a facade improvement, and new signs for Pep Boys. Gavin.
Good evening, Chair Harper Pedersen and members of the Planning Commission. My name is Gavin Monahan, and I will be taking you through an application tonight for Pep Boys. They have proposed new signage and also some minor changes to the facade of the building located at 1087 Old County Road. So the site is in one of our planned communities or planned developments. It's zoned PD12. Those are the new numbers that we came up with our rezone 2 years ago. And it's governed by Ordinance 1240. Ordinance 1240 was basically put in place for the development, original development of the structure and also of the site. But in this case, it does call out specific guidelines for a maximum amount of signage, and it allows more signage than would normally be allowed on a single building of that size on with the frontage of 2 streets. So that's the point of, I think, the specific point of Ordinance 1240 as it relates to signage. So the location here on Old County Road is Pep Boys. Their main sign in portico faces Old County Road, and the longer side of the building, their second facade faces Britton Avenue. So they have signage on both sides of the building. The facility next door is Kelly Moore. It's approximately 2.5 acre site, and it does have quite a bit of frontage. Actually, the frontage on Britton, or on Old County Road, is somewhat obscured by the elevated railroad tracks with the grade separation there. The project description is to replace the existing signage, put new wall signage up on 2 of the elevations, the one that faces Old County Road and also on Britton. The entrance sign, which is above their portico, would be replaced with the pictures of Manumo and Jack, which are the Pep Boys, and then the name Pep Boys below it. A similar logo would go on the Britton Avenue side with a slightly different layout where it's more linear, and then updates to the existing signage on the monument, and then some informational signage. So on one side facing the creek, they have a series of bays where they actually do maintenance on vehicles, and they have names above them. And then just to the left of the front portico is a description of some of the types of service that they provide. So all that signage would be removed, all the existing signage, would be removed, and the replacement signage, the new proposed signage that you see in your packet in front of you tonight would be, would go up in its place. The signs specifically are metal cabinets with translucent faces. They're lit with LEDs. They comply with our guidelines for the high-quality signage and that they have individual letters. Some of the things are spelled out in a cursive or have an underscore or an underline on them, so they're actually in one cabinet. But the shape of each individual letter lets it pop away from the building and gives some visual interest and a three-dimensional look to the signage, and that's something that we encourage. The other part of this is they're going to change the facade of the building, and when we say minor, they're not enlarging, extending, changing parapets, the portico. There's no major framing, structure, or square footage changes. It's just basically colors and materials. So you'll see in that packet that they have two new, there's several new colors, but the two that pop out are the trim colors, the red over the portico and then the blue, and those accent the signage. And then at the base of the building along the water table, they would be proposing to put a veneer stone on. The other element that you'll see is a wood band. It's actually a synthetic material here, and I can pass it around. It's a synthetic acrylic or vinyl that's been applied to an extruded or rolled sheet aluminum on the back. So it's lower maintenance than actually putting wood on a building that you'd have to oil, paint, or stain, or varnish, something like that. And the woods, natural woods change color, so if you're a corporate entity trying to have a specific sign program and look, it will change over the course of the years, whereas something like this material won't. And I'll bring it up to you so you can pass it around and take a look at it.
Thank you.
And there's some other minor changes to the building, including painting some of the elements. Basically, a refresh to an existing couple decades old building. So this is the existing signage for Pep Boys. You'll recognize the logo. The proposed signage, and I'll talk a little bit about what's the proposed signage in your packet, and also the applicants here tonight have a slight modification. Let me explain that in a little more detail. The proposed signage shows an updated logo. It also shows the faces of the Pep Boys. In this depiction here, you can see the wood band. You can also see the veneer stone along the water table and the colors of paint. They're never done justice on an overhead projector. It tends to wash out the colors, but this does give you an idea of what they're proposing to do. The building right now has this indent. You can see the shadow on it. And originally, I had spoken with one of the applicants. There's a sign applicant and also the applicants themselves from the Pep Boys. And it was unclear, but we were under I think the sign company and staff were under the idea that they would not actually change the front of the building to be flat. So we wanted to clarify that. So in one of the iterations, they had proposed pushing that recessed area, making it flush with the front of the building. We like to see the differentiation in step backs and areas that can capture light or create shadows. It just breaks up bigger buildings and makes them smaller. If this building was new or being proposed as a new building, we would require a lot more articulation than it currently has. So it was planning staff's opinion that we wouldn't want to remove any articulation or any building elements that help create shade and shadow, and we'd want to either keep the minimum or increase that. So that was our recommendation. In response to that, the applicants provided us a revision to the plan set that you have, and I'm going to have them, when they come up to present after me, I'll have them give you a new copy of those plans that shows what their proposal is. And that would be to retain that step in where you see the shadow along the Pep Boys, that white stripe and the rectangle that's above the entrance fenestration. They'd preserve that, and then in order to have the size that sign they want with Manny, Mo, and Jack, they'd put the elements of the characters above that and the sign in the inset. And staff's recommendation was to maintain the inset. So it's up to the Planning Commission tonight to decide on the current proposal that they will show you whether you think it complies. And I'm certainly here to answer the questions about does it meet our numerical sizing for maximum signage and is it appropriate. So, but I will let them explain that to you. So that this is their goal to maintain this recess is to put the lettering for Pep Boys in here, then separate the faces, push them up a little bit so that they would be in this artificial gable that's created on the front entrance of the building. This is the existing Britton Avenue fenestration or lack of fenestration. It has these arbors here with the lettering, and then the proposal would be with the new colors, the stone water table. The wood accent just wraps the building, so it's on the front facade facing Old County Road, and then it wraps towards the north and the south by maybe 12 or 16 feet, just enough that it wraps the band, and it doesn't look like it was cut off at the edge of the building. So it's a nice look.
That's better.
And then this is the existing monument sign. I'll go back through these here. And the monument sign, we get the same colors and the same logo treatment. So in order for the Planning Commission to approve it, you must make the required findings for approval. I have two sets of findings in the staff report and also on the slides tonight. The first set are the findings of approval for signs, and they're listed out here, and they're also detailed in the staff report. The second set of findings are for design review. We've included them as bullets and removed the design review findings are not applicable to this type of a minor facade change. So these would be the three findings that are applicable. And a discussion of these three findings has been included in the staff report. So planning staff is recommending approval tonight based on the application that we submitted to you on the 11 by 17 set of plans. As I mentioned earlier, the applicants have modified the plans in an attempt to keep that inset, and I would have them come up and maybe give a quick presentation to you about what their proposal is, how it may change or differ, what aspects of it are the same in the packet you have tonight, and what aspects are different. And then we can visit the approval process for that, whether you want to codify it in a narrative to staff or a resubmittal or there's any number of ways that we can go forward from here. But staff is recommending approval for the proposal that you see in front of you tonight, and I've created a formal motion. I'll leave it on the slide should you want to read from that or modify it. And I'm available for questions if you have any about this particular application.
Great. Does anybody have any questions for Gavin at this point?
Yeah. The pictures you showed there, the colors that you're seeing on your slide versus the colors that are on the printout here seem different. And I'm trying to understand which one is really the accurate color. Because what I'm seeing here in front of me looks almost like the red is more like a rust, and on there it looks more red.
I think it's so. One of the things we do, and certainly, I believe they have material chips to look at, which are really helpful. We typically ask for the brand name so that we can capture in tonight's meeting the actual brand name color. So we'll say Kelly Moore Gray or Benjamin Moore Dusk or whatever the particular color is. In this case, it's Admiral Blue and Gypsy Red. So those are specific colors. I did have a conversation with the applicants about bringing one of the color chips. So they're nice to see, like you have that vinyl actual sample of the wood band to look at, and it gives you a great feel of what it's going to actually look at. So I'll let them address that if they have samples tonight, or if not, if they're able to describe the colors. But they do not come out great in color reproductions or on the overhead slides.
Thank you. Any other questions for Gavin at this point? Gavin, I just had one. Has there been any public comment or concern about this project?
No, we did a public notice, 10-day public notice for signs that went out a week and a half ago, and we've not received any comments. Staff has not received any.
Great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Great. Now, would the applicant like to come up and show your new version? And please introduce yourself in the microphone for the record.
My name is Allison Mathern, Mathern. I am with Pep Boys corporate office in Philadelphia. Again, here to just fill you in on what we're doing and why we're doing it. So let me
Great.
just hand these out.
Hi, I'm Bill Lockett with SEMA Network. We are the national sign contractor for Pep Boys.
Thank you. Thank you.
You did?
And I handed.
Oh, yes. Could you introduce yourself?
My name is David Ford. I'm the applicant who submitted the application on behalf of Pep Boys and SEMA Network.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah. I can add as needed, but Allison from Pep Boys can provide the information on why this branding is being done and sort of some why the change was made to the front facade.
Terrific. Thank you.
So Pep Boys is a corporate. Every one of our stores is corporately owned. We've been in business since 1921, and in late 2012, we embarked on a rebranding of all of our stores. We first remodeled the Tampa Market. They've been doing extremely well for the year plus that they've had the new branding. And so now we're starting to expand it nationwide, and we decided to come to San Francisco as our first West Coast market to test the new branding. And well, not to test it, we're rolling it out across the country. So to start with a West Coast market. So what you see here is basically bringing back the Pep Boys. The Manny, Mo, and Jack on the top. I don't know how familiar you are with the brand, but they were real people. We still have one of their great-grandsons working for us. And so, we're kind of going back to the iconic branding. So as you see, it's intended to be a much more upscale look to the buildings than the kind of tired stuff we have out there now. And as Gavin mentioned, we have the stone veneer at the base of the building, fresh new colors, the metal wood look banding around the building, and again, the new text and the Manny, Mo, and Jack heads as part of the signage. So what was presented previously was, I believe it was 174 total square footage of signage. Upon getting the planners, the staff review, one of their comments was to leave that recessed portion of the building there. In order to accomplish that, the sign would have had to be very small to entirely fit within that recessed portion. So what we did was separate the Manny, Mo, and Jack and the Pep Boys script a bit, and we did make them both significantly larger in order to, have good visibility. The wood banding at the base would still be on the outside of the parapet, if you will, if that makes sense. And we also feel that adding the wood banding will give a little bit of that articulation that you're looking for, because that actually stands out from the face of the building as well. So just to reiterate, so the sign A, which is the Manny, Mo, and Jack and the Pep Boys script, went from, I believe it was 70-some square feet to 160.5 square feet, which is a significant change. None of the other signs proposed changed, so we now are proposing a total of 237.5 square feet, which is under the 260 that's permitted. That's pretty much it. The Manny, Mo, and Jack and Pep Boys are face-lit and reverse-lit letters, so they actually look really nice at night because they stand off the building and there's a little bit of a halo behind them, so they don't look like weird floating heads. And then the auto service tires parts is also illuminated, but it's not backlit. And all of the signs, as I assume they are now, are turned off an hour after the building's closed, so they're not on all night, as well as the one that faces the other road would be as well.
Great, thank you. Does anybody have any questions?
I have one question. So the Pep Boys in the recessed area there,
Yes.
And now you have the wooden band underneath.
Yes.
Is there an open area between the recess going all the way down, or is that wood band actually filled in behind what is the recessed area right now?
To be honest with you, we have not addressed that design-wise because we just made this change based on the review letter we got late last week. I believe we could do it either way. So if you had a preference, we could put something just at the bottom so that when you look up, you don't see a gap.
I would only say one word, and that is pigeons.
That's an important word. We
So,
probably would want to put a
I don't-
return at the top and the bottom then
Well,
to fill that gap
even if
in.
you make that ledge up there, it may be perfect for them to nest.
on it. Okay,
So
yeah.
that's the only thing
Yeah,
you might want to consider.
okay. We will
I-
definitely take that into consideration when we look at the design.
Absolutely.
Any other questions for the applicant at this point? I have a question. I'm sorry, I'm not sure if you're the best person to answer it. The current sign is not illuminated, is it? It's not backlit or
is illuminated.
It is illuminated.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Huh. Okay, yeah, I guess I just,
I don't think I've ever seen.
yeah, I don't think I've ever seen it illuminated, so yeah, okay, thank you very much.
I think it's also red letters, so it's probably not quite as noticeable as a white sign
Right,
would be.
right.
So,
Okay, thank you. Any other questions for the applicant at this point? Okay, thank you. Gavin, could you come up one more time? I just have one quick question about the illumination. So,
Yes.
has there been any concern about the illumination of the Pep Boys sign?
We have a lighting standard that's numerical about, and it discusses foot candles at property lines. So we have a standard that's in the municipal code that has to be met. And we also looked at, there's a little bit of lighting in the wood band across the front portico, just that, it's about a 40-foot section. And we discussed that and looked at the proposal with the LEDs. And the goal is obviously not to have a glare or scream. Our sign code actually, I think, uses the term that signs shouldn't compete with each other or scream, that they should be, attract attention to the building and help sales and promote the business, but not necessarily be a shouting match. So that is the goal. But as far as the lighting, we have that as a numerical standard,
Thank you,
not to
Gavin.
exceed. Mhm.
Does anybody have any other questions for Gavin at this point? Nope. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Okay, well, seeing no public comment on this item, do the commissioners have comments or?
I think it's an improvement.
It's a huge improvement.
I'd have to
Improvement's
say
not
the
strong
same
enough
thing.
a
It
word.
looks much better. Yes. Okay, well then at this point, Gavin, I guess the question would be if we were to motion to approve, do we motion to approve?
The new
The new version with the new square footage.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's my understanding that the side sign does not change in size, just and I've got to pull my staff report out, just the front sign. So
Right.
we can, in your packet tonight, which I will receive a copy and can stamp it with tonight's date, we can read in the square footage sign, and I wrote it down, I can go down and get it, that Allison read out, I think it's like 160 square feet. So you could read that into your formal approval. You could read the formal motion with the change that the front sign that's in the entrance portico would change from 70-something square feet to 160. And again, I have my notes on the table. You could just read that in as a numerical thing. You could also make reference to the plans that were received tonight, but I would like you to read both, if possible, read both the number, the maximum that she stated, and then also the plans, because staff is not, we received them this afternoon, I think at 3 o'clock or so, was when I opened this PDF. So we have not had a chance to add up the sign. So I would like to, for the record, have a maximum amount of signage that would be allowed. And it needs to be underneath the maximum allowed in that zoning, in that ordinance, 1240.
Okay, and it looks like the total square footage of the sign on the new one is 237.5.
That's what I recall,
Okay.
yes.
And so you'd like us to read that number into the motion?
Yeah, if possible. I just think it's nice to capture that for the record.
Yeah, I agree. Okay. All right, would somebody like to make a motion?
Sure. I move that the Planning Commission approve the request for design review approval of Pep Boys for minor facade improvements and new signage for a total request of 237.5 square feet of sign area at 1087 Old County Road, based on the required findings and for the reasons as outlined in the staff report, based on the plans that were received at the Planning Commission tonight.
Second.
Okay. All those in favor? Aye. Great. Motion passes. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Gavin.
You're welcome.
Okay, we're going to move on to item B, which is the consideration of zoning ordinance amendments to the San Carlos zoning ordinance, Title 18 of the San Carlos Municipal Code, consisting of correction, clarification, and minor improvements to both land use regulations and development standards. Just a quick note of the typo. It's in item B, San Carlos. But Lisa, I know we've got a lot of stuff to cover here.
Okay. Okay, thank you and good evening, Madam Chair, Planning Commissioners. My name is Lisa Porras and I'm a principal planner here for the City of San Carlos. So indeed, as you mentioned, we have a number, I think there's roughly just over 50 proposed modifications to the zoning ordinance. And so before I get started with the bulk of my presentation, I just wanted to inform the Commission that there's no push by staff to get all of this done in one sitting. And I don't imagine that we would. It's not our expectation that we would do that. There may be items that we would want to have further discussion on. In fact, there are several that we'll all highlight as part of the discussion where they really fall into levels of policy discussion. How do we want to treat certain issues? And these are things that we have dealt with in the past, so they won't be completely unfamiliar. But we'll have an opportunity to talk about those. So again, no rush to get this done in one fell swoop, but certainly if there are items that the Commission feels are ready to move forward, and there's other items that warrant further discussion, we can take certain things off and table it for further discussion, so we don't have to hold up the whole thing.
Great.
So with that, as you know, the city zoning ordinance has been in place for 2 years. I should say the current and new updated zoning ordinance has been in place for 2 years. So we have had some time to put it into practice, work with the applicants and staff to implement the regulations in the zoning ordinance. As part of the 2-year process, we've come to see certain things that need attention, things that need to be cleaned up. The amendments that are before the Commission tonight include things like minor corrections where the ordinance might refer to the planning division as the planning department, and we're not a department, we're a division of the community development department. We want to clarify some procedures with respect to noticing and timelines and what levels of review certain projects receive. And we're also proposing, and largely this is coming out of putting the zoning ordinance in place for putting the zoning ordinance into practice, is propose minor improvements with respect to land use regulations and standards for development. Now, these will be things that are new, that we're adjusting, but these are minor. We're not here to change the large community-wide effort that went into place as part of creating and adopting the 2011 zoning ordinance. It's really just fine-tuning. But there are a couple things that we need to address in our zoning ordinance as they arise throughout time, and that's to comply with state law. And there's a couple of items in the report that I will touch upon. So overall, just to orient you with what's in the staff report, the proposed amendments are in the staff report noted as several exhibits under Attachment 1. Attachment 1 of your staff report is the resolution, so the resolution is referring to the proposed amendments as exhibits to those attachments. So we have one change in Article 1 that's listed as Exhibit A, several changes in Article 2, Exhibit B, more changes in Article 3, and then changes in Article 5. We didn't need to change anything in Article 4. So on this slide here is just a representation to kind of orient you. So there's only one sheet of changes for Article 1, and that has to do with floor area ratio. And then under Article 2, it begins with pages 27 through 131. And I only printed out the pages where there were changes. So in your staff report, it's not the full zoning ordinance amendment, of course. And then Article 3, pages 140 to 331. Article 5, pages 426 to 460. However, there's also additional changes that staff is proposing that don't really relate to the zoning ordinance directly, but perhaps indirectly. And I'll point those out. Attachment 2 consists of changes to the city's parking exception fund. The city collects fees for parking in lieu, and there's language in there on what those funds can be used for, the procedure by which they would be evaluated, and we've made some changes so that the Title 3.36 is consistent with the language that we've already adopted in our zoning ordinance concerning in lieu fees. So while the Planning Commission's responsibility is not for Section 336 of the Muni Code, we are interested in hearing from the Planning Commission about those recommended changes before we send them on to City Council. Attachment 3 consists of a land use summary matrix, and that's that large, very colorful table should be the last portion of the packet. And what our objective was to create an overarching table for every land use classification that we have in our zoning ordinance. And so we can clearly see where that use is allowed. So you can just go across the table and see, if I want to know, for example, where I can put in a kennel, a pet kennel, I can see exactly which zones that's where they're in. So we wanted to share this with you. This has red line strikeout in it to be consistent with the changes that we're recommending for tonight. So this is a draft document, of course. And the idea is that once we get through these zoning ordinance amendments, we will revise this land use summary matrix, put it on our website, hand it out to folks. We get a lot of questions like, I'm looking to do this type of business in the city, and what are the different zones that I can do that in? And it'll be all in one place. So it's a really nice tool to have. Most zoning ordinances have it, but ours didn't have a comprehensive land use summary matrix. So that's just there for reference. And I think it's really helpful. So we're excited about having it completed. So with that, let's see. Let's do a couple of administrative items before I dive into the presentation. I notified the Planning Commission of one missing sheet. That was sheet 229 concerning zoning administrator approval for off-site parking facilities. That has been provided and added to the packet. I'd also like to note that on page 142, the reference to grown, this has to do with hedge height, has been removed. We had recommended deleting it, but after further review, we believe that it's no longer necessary. So the reference to grown on page 142, you can just omit that. And of course, if you like.
Oh, 2?
Yeah.
Okay, B2.
Sorry.
Oh, that's okay.
Oh,
Yeah,
I see
please
it.
interrupt me anytime, because I want to make sure that before we start, you have the most recent changes.
So
Got it.
page 142.
It's 142, which should be in
Number 2.
Exhibit C. So if you get to Exhibit C, there's a fly
Okay.
sheet for that. It's the second page of it,
Okay.
actually the
So you're-
third page of Exhibit C.
What is the change that you're making now?
On page 142, the strikeout of the term grown, we changed our mind. We want to keep grown in there.
Ingrown.
Right.
Got it.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. And this is minor, but I just want you to have all of this before we get into discussions and have questions.
So can I also say that the numbering in here doesn't match the numbering in the
In the zoning ordinance.
zoning ordinance?
Yeah, because when we print them out one page at a time, it's offset. So when we refer to the numbers,
Why they're off by one page?
pardon?
Is that why they're off by one page?
Yeah, they're slightly off because when we make changes, the formatting gets adjusted when you use red line strikeout, so we're not able to keep the exact pages. So when we talk about page numbers, we're referring to those page numbers in the staff report. So that's actually a good point.
Yeah,
Thanks for
okay.
bringing that up. Let's see. As far as, they're not changes to the materials in the exhibits, but on page 3 of the staff report is actually an omission in the table. So I just want to make it very clear what we're doing. For unbundling parking, which is already provided on page 220, you have it, so if you had a chance to flip through it, this won't be new information. But unbundling parking, the clarification for that didn't make it into the table. So this is just information. Also, on page 289, we made a slight change, not a change, but a clarification to the use of the term accessory use. Accessory uses by definition are uses that take up no more than 30% of the floor area. So we're just, again, as we read through the zoning ordinance, wherever we can clarify and elaborate, that's what we're doing.
Can you I'm sorry, can you repeat that last one? To what page?
Accessory use, page 289. It's in your materials, it just isn't on the table. So my concern was that if you were to go through the table and didn't see something, I didn't want you to think it was left out. And that's it. Oh, actually, one more thing now that we're talking about numbering. Let's fix, the numbering was off for Exhibit B, some of the pages in Exhibit B. So if you can turn to Exhibit B, and within Exhibit B, if you go to page 86, and then turn the page over, you can see how the formatting has changed on the next page. So on the opposite page of 86, if you turn the page, it reads 29. That should be 89. So just go ahead and write that in there. And I apologize for this. We try our best to get the page numbering system in place, but again, it's kind of hard. So that's page 89. Now the next page reads page 30. That should be page 90. That way when we talk about this stuff, we'll all be on the same page, so to speak. And then finally, the next page is page 32. That should be 91. And then after 91 should be 95. Okay, good. Okay, I promise that's it. Thank you. Okay, so let's get started.
All right.
So the next several slides provide a summary of the changes that we're going to make. And our expectation is that we don't need to dive necessarily, as far as my presentation goes, into each one of these because there are very many. So I'm going to touch upon them. If we have questions about them, we can talk about it. So this first slide here represents a list of corrections. So these are all the corrections that needed to be made to the ordinance. There were references that needed to be made to the many figures in our zoning ordinance. For some reason, it must have been the font. It didn't print out correctly, and so you have these symbols where there should be numerical references. So those are now being corrected. In the MUN zoning district, it listed a height limit of 2 stories. That is not the case. It's 4 stories, consistent with the other height limits in the other mixed-use zoning districts. So that needed to be corrected. There's also numerical references missing from the graphics, kind of similar to figure references. We needed to make some changes there as well. We clarified and corrected regulations regarding to tree removals. For every decision that we make, as you know, we have a 10-day right of appeal. Tree removals had a different noticing requirement, so we wanted to make it consistent with the 10-day. In our parking requirements, for every land use classification, there's a parking standard. In our parking section, it referred to employment use classifications. There's no such thing as employment. We call those industrial use classifications. So that's just a minor cleanup. We also corrected sidewalk clearance for outdoor dining and retail sales. Right now in the code, it reads 6 when it should be 4. And this is after confirming that with our Public Works division as well. With respect to outdoor storage, there are a couple of areas in the code where it did not reflect outdoor storage where it's permitted as an accessory use. In some areas, outdoor storage is permitted as a primary use, a standalone use. In other areas, it's only allowed as an accessory use. We also clarified under outdoor storage, there's a table under the specific uses and activities section of our zoning ordinance where it didn't reflect some of the outdoor storage changes that were made as part of the landmark commercial amendments that were done last year. We corrected the noticing requirement for second unit waiver hearings to be consistent with the 10-day notice requirement we do for all projects. We removed references to the redevelopment agency. It no longer exists. Like I mentioned at the beginning, we removed reference to planning and building department. Planning and building are divisions, not departments. We removed senior citizen residential land use as it is listed in a land use table in the mixed-use districts, not because the use isn't allowed, but because it's already accounted for under multifamily. So having it listed out separately was redundant. The same with pet daycare. Pet daycare is already reflected in kennels, so it would be redundant to have it listed out again. So those are just corrections, if you will, just very, very easy, very validated corrections that need to be made. The second area of amendments are clarifications. In the RS zoning district, there's development standards for how the second story should be treated, where it may align with an elevation below. So we cleaned up some of the language. There was it was kind of open to interpretation, and through many discussions that our staff has had with applicants, we felt it was necessary to clarify where exactly second stories could align with the stories below. We had a regulation in place that basically created a standard where you would need to measure one building from another, even though they were on separate lots. And as our practice is, we measure based upon property lines. So we wanted to get rid of that in the ordinance because it was not practical, or development should be regulated based on property lines. We clarified some of the nomenclature. We have setbacks, building setbacks from property lines, but also in our code we have building step backs from the elevation below. So for example, in many areas of the ordinance, the 4-story is required to be stepped back from the elevation below. So in some areas of the code, it was using the word setback. So we wanted to be very clear on what those were. And we wanted to clarify that if anyone is going to request a waiver from our below market rate housing ordinance, that it be done, that it's very clear in our ordinance that that needs to be done concurrent with the application, not later. We clarified some of the findings for tree removals. We clarified that who was a responsible party for landscape and tree maintenance. This is even for trees that are not within the property boundary, but could be adjacent to the property along the sidewalk. There's a section in the ordinance that deals with public streets. It's kind of a section of the ordinance that Public Works deals with a lot. And in that section, it clarified landscaping responsibilities to be the responsibility of the property owner. So we wanted to just carry over the same language to be consistent when we talked about landscaping in the zoning ordinance. We wanted to clarify that the director doesn't approve minor use permits. It's actually the zoning administrator who approves minor use permits in general and also for off-site parking facilities. We clarified the section in the code with respect to unbundled parking. There was some misunderstanding when the Transit Village came through that unbundled parking was required. If an applicant is proposing to unbundle parking, certain criteria needs to be met, so we just cleaned up the language for that. And we also addressed references to mini storage and personal storage where we have regulations in place that limit and prohibit those in certain circumstances. Now on to the improvements. The improvements are actual changes where we're changing some of the development standards for projects, for new development. In our ordinance, we have a section that addresses floor area coverage. This is actually the only amendment being done to Article 1. This has to do with exempting side-loaded and detached garages from the floor area ratios that are otherwise required. In our ordinance, we had that set at 400 square feet. But given that the parking garage dimensions are 20 by 20, if you only count the interior, if you, it wouldn't even account for a regulated garage size at 20 by 20. So we increased that to 450 to account for, the width of walls and the actual construction component of the garage itself. We're also proposing a minor increase to the RS3 lot coverage standard. Right now, the RS3 lot coverage standard is 25%, which has presented limitations to property owners who want to do a small addition or enlarge certain areas of their home. We're proposing that 25% be increased to 35%, and that would be commensurate with the city's increase of lot coverage to the RS6 within properties under the RS6 zoning district. That was done during the 2011 zoning ordinance update. So in RS6, you can have 50%. Previously, it's my understanding that was 40. So that increased, by a factor of 10. And we want to do the same for RS3 to give property owners some flexibility. So there's been a couple of different cases where property owners haven't been able to do any kind of addition to their home. With respect to open space and common area dimensions for multifamily projects, in the ordinance it listed a singular formula for determining open space, so we're adding some flexibility with respect to that. Again, in the ordinance there was some inconsistency with respect to window trim and recess standards. In some areas, windows were required to be recessed by 2 feet, in other areas by 1. We changed it all to be 2 feet. We also cleaned up the section where we restrict snap-in vinyl mullions on windows in certain zones, but not in others. So we standardized the same restriction throughout, not throughout all of the districts, but for all projects within the mixed-use districts. And then there's a requirement that certain projects have wainscoting incorporated in the design of the projects. We wanted to add some flexibility for alternative designs, recognizing that not all projects are using the same architectural formula. And while wainscoting is an important feature, we feel that designers can come up with reasonable alternative designs rather than a one-size-fits-all. We changed the applicability requirements for the hillside development overlay regulations. Right now, anything with an average slope of 10% or more goes into our hillside overlay district and is required to comply with some of the standards therein. In some cases, in many cases, we've seen only a small portion of the lot having, some topography, and this can impact the character of the neighborhood with respect to garage setbacks, because if you're in the H overlay and you have if you meet the slope requirements, then you can have your garage as close as 5 feet from the property line. So we wanted to clean that up. We're also clarifying building design standards for projects that are within the hillside overlay district with respect to articulation as seen from the down facing slope. So we wanted to provide more flexibility to architects rather than a one formula regulation. I have probably a few more slides on these, so thanks for your patience, but I just want to make it clear what we're doing, and we have the time to do it. Other improvements, we wanted to address tents. We have lots of questions where you can put a tent, where it's allowed, how long it's allowed for. So we clarified 2 areas in the ordinance to regulate tents, both in the accessory structures section of the ordinance as well as the temporary use section of the ordinance. With respect to fences, there's language in the ordinance that refers to the protection of views. This can often be problematic, as you might suspect. If a fence is up, someone could easily say it's blocking their view, while the fence may meet code, maybe up to code. So we're moving the reference to private views with respect to fences. For single-family and duplex projects, we feel it's important to provide, for applicants to provide a landscape plan. Right now, they're exempt from it, although many applicants do. There have been times where there's been resistance or some confusion by applicants as far as the level of detail they need to provide for landscaping. And certainly for new single-family homes, we think it's important, and I think we all have experienced how landscaping can play a role and add to the value of the discussion with respect to new single-family homes. We want to discuss with the Commission non-conforming setbacks. This is an area that I want to touch upon later in the presentation. We wanted to add some flexibility with garages right now in the code. If you're going to build a garage, it can only be 20 by 20, and that's it, regardless of the lot width. So our code already allows for tandem garages, or tandem parking, I should say. So by extension, we want to allow for tandem garages as well, as another alternative to the 20 by 20. In our sign ordinance, we really want to address signs that are very flat, that have plastic materials or materials that are not of quality, and signs that come without any raised or individual letters. We think we can do better, so we're prohibiting those types of signs, and there's language in the ordinance to address that. With respect to the second unit parking waiver, we're adding in some language that would allow alternatives to parking for second units. For triangle lots, currently right now we only establish the rear lot line for triangle lots, but recently we've seen some triangle lots where the front of the property is really at that triangular section. So we need to clean that up and also address the front lot line as well as the rear lot line in lots that have a triangular configuration. So now we're getting on to land use improvements. There are some sections on the zoning map where mixed-use districts were across the street, directly across the street from residential, so where they faced each other, where two mixed-use districts face each other. There weren't very many, and I apologize I don't have a slide to show you, but if you open up the zoning map and look carefully, you'll be able to find those. I think there's 3 areas. So in those areas, we wanted to increase the level of review for certain types of uses where that situation occurred, and we also wanted to prohibit certain uses where that interface occurred. So the next couple of points relate to where we're increasing the level of review for certain uses. The first one is cinema and theaters. We don't want to allow those when those front residential uses. That's our recommendation. Also for small-scale commercial entertainment and recreation as well. When situations arise where that type of use could be directly across from residential, we want to regulate it, limit it. Same with hotels and motels, convenience market, food and beverage type of businesses, and restaurants as well. For recycling, collection, and processing facilities, we're increasing the level of review from permitted by right to a conditional use permit. And we wanted to clarify, not clarify, but further refine that outdoor storage as a primary use is not consistent with the landmark commercial zone that we established last year. For freight and truck terminals, we're increasing the level of review from permitted by right to requiring a CUP in the IL, Limited Industrial Zoning District. And for waste transfer facilities, rather than those being permitted by right, they should be really addressed by a conditional use permit. Other sections that we're proposing, areas that we're proposing, are really to comply with state law. In 2012, cottage food, I can't remember the exact name of the act. I think it's not cottage food, it's something else. But there was a law that was passed to allow individuals in their homes to have a cottage food operation, so they can make food at home, they can distribute it out to farmers markets or certain vendors, or they could actually even have direct sales on site. Now, the cottage food operation differs from a home occupation in that it allows, it will allow up to one equivalent full-time employee, whereas under home occupations, you're not allowed to have any employees. So cottage food, they will allow one. They will also allow direct sales on site. The law does give the city the latitude to impose operational standards for this type of use. And as a starting place, what we're proposing is that any cottage food operation that does not have an employee, that is not wanting to have direct sales on site, can be permitted by right. If a cottage food operation wants to have a full-time employee and have some sales on site, then we're requiring a minor use permit. There's additional things that we could do with respect to cottage food operations, and that could be we can regulate the concentration of them. So, for example, if we only wanted to allow one cottage food operation per block, that's within our purview to do. We could also address parking if we want to ensure that there is a parking space for a full-time employee to work at someone's home as part of the cottage food business operation, then we can put regulations in place with respect to that. We can also request information for how the property owner may choose to address parking. So if somebody wants to come directly to the home and purchase some food items, where would they park, or set some parameters in place for that. So that's an item that we can discuss further, and I'd like to hear some comments from the commission regarding that. Other areas that we needed to change to be consistent with state law has to do with family child care operations. First of all, the name changed. It used to be called family daycare, small or large, but actually the state refers to it as family child care. So we changed the name, and we ensured that the definitions between small and large are consistent with the state definition. So this is one that's very easy, very straightforward. We modified our language where it was needed and made it consistent with state law. The other area that we need to address, and this will come up with a housing element if it doesn't get addressed now, and that has to do with supportive and transitional housing. And I'll just clarify what we mean by transitional housing. Transitional housing is housing with supportive services for up to 24 months. And this is targeted to folks that have been recently homeless, and they want to move from the homeless shelter to a more stable living environment that allows them to get their lives in order to be able to then move on to a regular market rate housing situation. And transitional housing, per state law, needs to be regulated the same and no different as any other residential use. With respect to supportive housing has no limit on the length of stay, and there's usually services that are provided on site. The type of folks in supportive housing could be there without any limit, again, on their length of stay due to their health status. That there's something there where they need, more permanent form of living rather than another type of housing situation. And so what the state is saying, that cities, not just San Carlos, but all jurisdictions in California, need to treat these uses no different than they would any other residential uses, to allow them where we allow residential, and also to regulate them where regulate them no different than residential housing. I will say that it's not exactly clear, and we're still working to figure out where state law really addresses this. And that is, when you have a transitional or supportive housing project that may be of a certain size, say greater than 6 units, do cities have any ability to regulate the operations of such facilities? So the state law is not really clear on that. So what we're doing right now is we're bringing it to the Commission's attention to let you know that we as a city need to address it. But we still have some time before we need before we can figure out exactly how we want to regulate it, if we're allowed to regulate some of the operational features of this type of housing if they are over a certain size. But what we're hearing right now is that we can treat them no different. So maybe they have the same development standards, but again, we need to figure out if there's any operational or use standards we can put in place with respect to those two. So those are the items that we need to address per state law. With respect to nonconforming structures, there's different ways that cities can address nonconformities, pre-existing nonconformities in building structures. A structure can have a nonconforming building height. Maybe it's taller than what the code might otherwise allow. They can also have nonconformities with respect to setbacks. And so the question that comes into play is, how do we as a city want to regulate additions on projects where there's nonconformities? Some cities say that regardless of what kind of addition you do or what your existing condition might be, when you build new, it needs to be to code. Other cities allow for some flexibility, which is what the city of San Carlos has done in recent practice using the 2011 zoning ordinance. And our code currently says that you can continue an existing non-conforming setback under certain criteria. And we wanted to clean up some of the language. The language in the code that's there right now says that you can remove no more than 50% of the wall and roof. And if you're doing a second-story addition, it's difficult to retain 50% of the roof. So we removed the reference to roof. And we wanted to clarify what we mean by 50%. So as a starting point, we're stating in our ordinance that 50% of the wall basically means that you can remove the siding of the wall, but you need to keep the framing in place. This is one way to do it. We can also look at perhaps requiring a higher level of review for projects where they may be wanting to reuse or extend a non-conforming section. So this is an item that I feel is worthy of discussion, and the commission may have some comments on that. There's no expectation that we resolve it tonight. I mentioned cottage food operations. We already went over that regarding concentration, parking for employees, and parking for customers. And we talked about supportive and transitional housing already. So those are the areas that we feel that kind of jump out, that come up to the surface right away: cottage food operations, supportive housing, and the non-conforming section of our ordinance. There may be others that you'd like to discuss based upon your review. And so at this point, again, I just want to reiterate that if there are some areas that the Planning Commission feels they can just move forward while we continue to address other items that merit more discussion, we can certainly do that. But again, there's no expectation that we do all this tonight. So with that, I think I'll take a seat because a lot of my material's over there, and any questions you have, we'll answer. I also invited Jill Lewis and Gavin Moynihan to accompany us tonight because they have been at the front line, so to speak, working with developers and applicants, homeowners, as they are attempting to, modify their home, build new projects. So they have a lot of firsthand experience on what they've heard over the counter and what's working, and can offer some additional insight as why we're making the recommendations that we are. So with that, that concludes my presentation, and again, we're available for questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Lisa. Oh, really quickly, what I was hoping we could do before we answer or ask questions, because I think we've got a lot of staff, or there might be quite a few, is allow our public comment speakers to come up and speak so that they don't necessarily have to listen to all of our
It's going to be a
comments,
long
if that's
meeting,
okay.
so you may want to do this now.
So thank you very much, Lisa. And I would like to invite Joe Samuels to come up and speak on the public comment item. Thank you. Sorry to interrupt you.
Good evening. I'm Joe Samuels, and my wife and I have lived in
same house in San Carlos for over 30 years. And the reason we're here tonight is because the Planning Division has told us that they're recommending a certain amendment to the zoning ordinance here tonight. And the amendment I refer to is at the bottom of page 31. Page 31 of the staff report. Okay. So I think it's referred to as the RS3 lot coverage minor increase. And it has to do with the minimum lot coverage of our home. So we got caught up in this because we'd been planning for some time to do a small room addition to our house, and we were going to start in 2012, and then we found out that the allowance for our home was reduced from 40% to 25%, and had been at 40% for a number of years in the past. So they reduced it from 40 to 25%. So essentially, we couldn't proceed on our project, and it's been on hold since the writing of this amendment. So we're really happy to be here tonight because the Planning Division has told us that they're recommending that this be changed from 25 to 35%. And 35% would be adequate for our needs and would allow us to go ahead with our modest addition, which has been a long time in the planning. And we really feel strongly that this change would greatly enhance our personal enjoyment of our home and also have a really positive impact on our potential property value in the future. So we're just here to add our support to the Planning Commission's recommendation for this amendment, and we hope you go ahead and pass it. So thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. And we also do have your letter.
Okay, great.
So that'll be entered into the public record also. So thank you very
All
much
right.
for coming.
Thank you. Thanks.
Okay, well, at this point, questions for staff? And Shannon, why don't we start with you?
I did have a question regarding the transitional supportive housing. Does that include, is that just homeless transitional housing, or does that include like drug and alcohol rehab housing? What is classified as transitional and supportive?
Well, it's my understanding that with transitional housing, there may or may not be services. So with respect to supportive housing, it's usually due to health-related concerns where they may need some assistance, permanent assistance in living. So the transitional housing, because there's no requirement for providing those services, isn't intended to be a fit for the population group that you were referring to.
Okay. And as far as the state regulation, could you give us the number or email us the number so I can look it up?
Yes, absolutely.
Staying on that same topic for a second, is there a limit when you talk about transitional housing? Is there a sort of density to the number of people who can be in a transitional housing situation? Or is this like a single room type thing where you could put 8 rooms on a single family home lot? And now I'm looking at other problems that could arise from that situation.
So in a single-family zoning district, if you were going to provide a transitional house intended for that particular purpose, it needs to meet the same standards as single-family. So in terms of density, in terms of development standards, all of that. So you can't treat it any differently. I don't have any examples of transitional housing that would come in a single-family typology. Most likely these are going to be at least a duplex or, a multifamily housing scenario. I know that for, emergency shelters, let's say, that's different. That's a facility where this is more like an independent unit. So you get more privacy, autonomy to live your life in that particular unit as you transition into a more permanent, stable living situation. But the question you have is a good one, and that's something we can ask for clarification from the state on, in terms of if you were to have a single-family transitional unit, what would be the maximum number of persons that could live in that type of a living facility? I think that's your question, right?
Yes. Sort of, and that sort of gets to another question, which is there any regulation when you start getting to the above a certain number between locations? I mean, is there a concern that we're going to put them all in one location versus spreading them out throughout the community? If they, in the same way you were talking about the cottage industry, where, we could say within, 300 feet or 600 feet, there can't be a second, and I'm just using that as an example, or not on the same street type thing. So that's another question to ask.
I should let the commission know that Lisa and I also discussed this quite a bit when she and I spoke Thursday, only because this happens to be one of my areas of, unfortunately, expertise, having worked a lot in downtown San Jose. Knowing that our configuration is much different, San Jose lends itself to some larger buildings, therefore also larger concentrations in certain areas of police referral, sober living environments, and other types of transitional housing. And so I did ask Lisa to look into what we are and are not allowed to do as far as the size of the transitional housing, the density, whether it's concentrated or whether there's an over-concentration in one area in the city or in the county. I think those are all fair questions that we'll hopefully get an answer to.
Yes, and as far as I know, the state's clear that saying you can't treat it very different, but a number of these questions have arose, and I even was speaking with a housing consultant, one of the consultants that attended our housing workshop, Joshua Abrams, so Scott, you'll remember him, and he said the state's not very clear. So it would be something that we would need to probably reach out specifically to HCD, the State Department of Housing and Community Development, to get one of their representatives to clarify, because the language of the law isn't exactly clear. So that's something that staff will continue to research on and then provide that information to you.
I'm curious if we could talk to a city that does have an ordinance surrounding large or surrounding facilities like that. I just think of San Jose in particular because they required conditional use permits on fraternities and sororities, all sorts of what they would call transient style housing. And I'm sort of curious what they're going to do now if the state law has changed, and maybe if they've already done some research, we wouldn't have to. Again, very different situation. I get it. We don't have a lot of 80-unit places stuck in the middle of residential areas, but they might have some.
And Madam Chair, if I could add a little bit about the history of how this has gone in the state. So historically, the state said that for like a large family, or a small family daycare or care facilities, they gave a numerical threshold historically, and they said, well, if it's 6 residents or under, then the city could not regulate.
I see.
And you couldn't have any kind of discretionary permit process. But anything over that, the city could impose like a CUP. So historically, that's the way the cities in the county have done this for many, many years. But in the reading of these definitions, they don't give those numerical standards anymore, and this is fairly new legislation, so we're sort of in a gray area here. So it's really unclear, I think, and just looking at the definitions, what the state's trying to say is, if you have a single-family house, 3 and 2, then however many people would normally be associated with a single-family house is how the jurisdiction should regulate it.
I see.
So it puts sort of the onus back on the city in a lot of ways, and makes it more difficult for us to figure these things out. But historically, that's the way it's been done. They've been very clear. They said hands off at this level, and but as you can imagine, there's concerns in the community when you start. The question of overconcentration becomes an issue, and parking and noise and other issues that you typically associate with a residential zone. So those are things that jurisdictions would typically like to have a say in.
Right.
So we need to do a little more work on this.
Thank you, Al. Okay, well, I think we've talked about that. All right.
Can I make a suggestion? I don't know if you guys want to go about it this way. Can we go I have mine marked off. Can we go through the ones that we don't really have an issue with and maybe go over those quickly and say, line by line? Does anybody have any comments on that one and move on? That way we can
Then we can
get
get rid
through
of
some
it.
of the ones
Yeah.
that really require a little more
Yes.
thought to it.
Okay. All right, Jesse, well, I agree. Let's go ahead and go through line by line. Then let's just make sure we're all going to use the table then as the line, if that's okay. I don't know if that's how everybody has it organized.
That's
so.
not really how I did it.
I
but-
know. And I have most of my notes on the phone because I was out of town. So I'm with you. But I think if we can try to follow that, that would
Item
be
by
good.
item?
Yeah, well, if we can just go item by item, does anybody have any questions or comments about that? Yes, no? And then if it's a yes, then we just come back to that.
As long as I can go through it, sort of looking at my notes at the same time.
Yeah.
That's fine.
Okay.
So,
All right, well, why don't we go ahead and start then for Table 1 and floor area exemptions, side-loaded detached garages.
I had nothing.
Nothing.
okay.
I don't have anything.
Okay.
How about if we just speak up if we have something and let
Yeah.
you.
Item 2, RS3 zoning district lot coverage provisions. That is the one that we also had a speaker talk about.
Yes, I had a question on that one.
Great.
So we'll move on. Do we want to go through the question? No, I think we just want to go through it and then we'll come back to that maybe?
Oh, I was thinking we would just go through, but okay. Yeah, we'll table that to the end. Okay, so 2, 3, second-story alignment in RS districts. Questions?
No.
Anybody? I actually do have one, so we're going to hold off on that. Distance between buildings on separate lots? No? That's number 4, distance. Measuring between the buildings
The
versus
buildings,
measuring
building,
from the
lot
lot
line.
line. So any comments on that?
No.
Okay. And we can go back, Scott, if we miss something, but generally we're thinking that looks fine. Okay. Number 5, clarify common area dimensions in RM zoning district.
No.
I can't even. I'm trying to follow where those are. Common area
I'll give you a second.
dimensions. That's yeah. It would be helpful if we looked at the page too. So that's page 47.
That's correct. And if the commission needs some help with page numbers, now that I'm looking at this table, it would have been really helpful for you. But I took the time to write them down. So, for
okay.
example, if as you're looking at number 5, that's page 47.
Okay. So no.
Okay. So no. So 5, we're good. Okay. Number 6, correct figure reference.
That's on page 51.
Yeah, I don't have any.
I didn't have anything on that. Anybody? Okay. Number 7, correct height limit for MUN zoning district. What page is that, Lisa?
Page 73.
73.
Wait a minute. Where did you skip to page 73? What happened to 65, 66,
I think that
67,
comes back.
68?
doesn't it?
So that's
was some
the,
flip-flop.
that's
Okay,
number,
we're looking at-
what is number 7?
Number 7 is page 73.
And what is page 6? Correct figure reference?
Page 6 is, number 6 is page 51.
So you've got a whole set of pages in between that you've made changes on that aren't on here.
They're probably part of Table 2. So I divided the tables up into development standards versus land uses.
Yeah.
Land use regulations, because those are the two sections of how we regulate land in the city under each of the zoning districts.
Okay, as long as you keep reading numbers, and we're going to have to keep going back through this.
Would it make sense just to go page by page and then decide if we want to just say yay or if we need further discussion instead of going by the table, which isn't going to be in numerical order?
Yeah, the table's not in order based
So, I
on,
mean, you know what I'm saying? Do we want to just, I mean, we can look at the strike-throughs and see if there's any, if we have any comments if we go page by page.
I thought mine was easier to deal with, but maybe it wasn't. Because I went through all the tables, and I just, yeah, you had to search around a little bit, but there was only a few that I really needed to.
whereas I went through and made comments on each one of
Each one.
on each page, or
Yeah.
or not.
Okay.
All right.
Well, I'm open to do it whatever way.
Scott, do you think it'd be easier for you to go page by page?
Yeah,
Okay.
actually, I
All right.
think.
I'm just going to rip my table off then real quick.
Why don't we start off by just writing down all the pages? Is that fine?
Yeah, because then
Yeah.
that way,
We can
Jesse,
shoot
you
over to-
can, yeah, you can shoot over, and then we'll go page by page.
Okay.
For Scott. So can we start at the top for number 1, and you can tell me which page reference it is, Lisa?
I'm sorry, through the chair, can you repeat that?
Can you start off with the first table and just go down them with which page references they are?
Sure, absolutely.
They are
Yes,
just
let's do that. Okay.
quick shot.
So number 1, that's the only page under Exhibit A. Number 2, page 31. Number 3, page 32. Number 4, page 42. Number 5, page 47. Number 6, page 51. Number 7, page 73. Number 8, page 76. Number 9, page 50 and 84. Number 10, page 50. Number 11, pages 86 and 95. Number 12, pages 91, 104, and 114. Number 13, page 127. Number 14, page 130 and 131. Number 15, page 154. Number 16, page 140 and 322. Page 17, number 17, I apologize for that, 141 and 142. Number 18, page 175. Number 19, page 192. Number 20, page 201. Number 21, page 202. Number 22, page 207. Number 23, page 213. Number 24, page 224. Number 25, page 229. 26, page 237. 27, page 285. Number 28, pages 297, 298, 300, 301, and 451. Number 29, pages 302 and 307. Number 30, page 308. Number 31, page 314. 32, 316. 33, pages 27, 28, 29, 65, 294, 295, and 426. There are many areas in the zoning ordinance that address that, so there are multiple pages. Number 34, pages 459 and 460. Number 35, page 159, 167, and 174. Number 36, page 200, 251, 270, 317, and 331. I have two more for this table that I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation. One is unbundled parking. That's not on table 1. So unbundled parking could be number 37. That's page 220. And then one more, accessory use, page 289. And now we could move on to table 2. Number 1 is page 65, 2, page 29 and 65, 3, 101, 4, 66, 5, 66, 6, 66 and 67, 7, 66 and 67, number 8, 89, number 9, 102 and 112, number 10, 102 and 112, number 11, 90, 103, 112, and 308. Number 12 is 103, number 13 is 103, number 14 is 100, and number 15 is 438.
All right. Cool. Thank you, Lisa. All right. Well, in that case, we're now going to go by the page number. Okay? Exhibit A, number 1. We already agreed nobody had anything on that, so we'll move on. Let's see. So now I'm going page number. So I'm just going to Article 2. What page would that be? 27?
Yeah, that would be 27.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry. Okay, and that involves item 33 a little bit, which just changes the word to child. I assume nobody has anything on that, so I'm going to move on to
Yeah. 28.
Okay, same thing. Data child. I'm going to move on. 29 is a little more with the changes as far as the family child care, but then it does have the supportive and transitional housing.
I think we're going to have a discussion
more.
about that, so.
And we've already had
This
some
is-
discussion on
Yeah.
that.
Is this just to remove this, because it's already covered under, this table that refers to it just being covered under other zoning? Or is that what you're referring to with this particular table?
You mean regarding family child care, Commissioner Bergman?
Under supportive housing and transitional housing, it looks like that's read it out. Is that just because that housing, that is designated in another? Is that
It's already in our zoning ordinance as a use classification, but it's not regulated in any of the land use tables of the zoning districts that we have in the city. So we need to address it with respect to where it's going to be allowed as a land use. But it's my understanding that that's one item where we need some more information on. So that portion of page 29 will be on hold.
Right.
Okay.
Okay. Moving on, page 30. I'm sorry, 31. At the bottom, again, we were talking about the maximum lot coverage. That was where our speaker was also talking. Does anybody have any comments or questions on that? I assume yes.
I just wanted background a little bit. How did it drop to 25, and then what's the thought process on 35?
Right, because our speaker said it had dropped from 40 to 25. Is that actually what happened? And
That could be what happened. There were many areas in what is now the RS3 and RS6 areas that were developed as planned communities, which are now called planned developments. So when staff went through and updated the zoning ordinance, they evaluated each one of these areas to determine which zone, either RS3 or R6, it would be a best fit with. And so it's my understanding that some of these areas, and maybe staff that was here that actually went through the zoning ordinance can jump in if you guys remember anything specifically, but it's my understanding that that could be the case as part of evaluating what was permitted as a planned community versus what would be for one area. Again, planned communities are just project specific. So when the city when the planning division went through the process of updating those zoning ordinance, rather than have multiple zoning development standards for all of these multiple projects, and the idea was to clean that up. So during that process, some of these areas could have been downzoned, if you will, which had a previous lot coverage size, a lot coverage requirement that was higher than the average standard for than what would be contemplated for the RS3. If staff wants to jump in, do you remember anything specifically different?
I think only for the specific cases where residents mentioned that they went from a 40% to down to 25% would be those PDs that were rezoned as RS6 or RS3. I mean, there were other instances where people on what used to be called R1LD, which is the now RS3, where they have smaller size lots. They're in the 7, 8, 9, 10,000 square foot range, and they run into impacts with being able to do an addition because they reach their maximum lot coverage pretty quickly. So that's the other group of people that would be affected by this.
right, it does seem that 25 is quite a low number, even for an RS3. So 35 seems better, but I guess the question would then be, why not 40?
Yeah.
Well, the reason staff is recommending an increase of 10 from 25 to 35 is because the analysis that was done when the zoning ordinance was comprehensively updated in 2011 allowed the RS6 to jump from 40 to 50%. So it's just the same level increase that was given to the RS6 would seem to be fair, logical for the RS3.
For reference, the R1LD was always 25% maximum lot coverage.
Okay, I see.
So just to clarify, the differentiation for the 25% is on the hillside lots.
Right.
And the reasons for that are because of the steepness of the lots and grading and impact to the environment, essentially, grading, retaining walls, that kind of thing.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you. Okay. So 35 sounds good then to me.
35 is keeping
30.
in the same proportion as the R6. Okay.
Okay, moving on, page-wise, 32.
Didn't have any.
Anything? Nope. 42. That was okay when we looked before.
So I have a quick question about that. So you removed the whole thing that says minimum distance between buildings, but so you removed the 6 feet, you removed the 20 feet, the whole line, right?
That is correct.
You
So
don't-
the staff is recommending that we remove that regulation, the requirement to have a numeric maximum for the distance between buildings, but buildings that are on separate lots, rather than regulate buildings distance-wise from the property lines,
So
of their own property line.
where is this now? Where is the other piece of this?
Meaning, where does it say that we will
setback
measure
from
from
that
the property line?
Yes.
Sorry.
Well, the definition
that-
of setback probably.
Is
It's just a
that
little bit up the table under setbacks. So that would be
Okay.
In the scenario here, the interior side setback is what would regulate the distance of the building from the property line.
Okay, because the way I read this was a minimum distance between buildings on the same property, not on different properties.
Are there a lot of those?
Under the, well, if we look at the entire table, including the graphic that is provided along with this, with these development standards, it's referring to number 9, which the number, it's located in a black circle on the graphic. It's sitting right on the property line. So in this graphic here, it's depicting 2 separate lots in 2 different buildings shaded in gray. And the regulation is referring to the distance between those buildings across the property line.
I see, because
Okay.
the property line is depicted.
So the question I'm going to ask is there a minimum distance between buildings on the same lot?
There is. We have some standards as far as how the distance required between detached buildings. If anyone has those numbers off the top of their head, feel free to chime in. Thank you, Joe.
6 feet. So that's why I'm thinking that that's what that was meant to be, and not necessarily the way it was drawn in the figure. So I'm wondering if maybe it's not the line that's wrong, but that the figure is actually showing the distance between buildings on the same. We could accomplish the same thing by removing the little 9 on the left-hand figure and just showing it on the right-hand figure, where you're showing 2 buildings on the same lot.
I think that's something that we could explore.
Okay.
I'm looking at
This,
I see what you're saying.
the other numerical value, which is 20.
yeah.
And if the basic standard is to require 6 feet minimum distance between buildings on, on any RS lot, then the 20 wouldn't be consistent with the 6-foot distance.
These are not RS, they're RMs. So the question is the 20 feet on the RM 59, because of the increased density of the buildings, you actually want a little bit more space between the buildings. So that's sort of where I think this line is really looking at, because when you look at the RM 59, that's a multifamily medium density versus an RM 20, which is a multifamily low density. And so with the increased density, you want more space between the buildings. And that's what I think that was getting at originally, rather than the distance between buildings on adjacent properties, which is sort of covered up above under minimum setbacks.
We can certainly evaluate this.
Take a look
investigate
at
this
that,
more,
because I
certainly,
think
because
that-
I
that-
understand what
Yeah.
what you're saying. We would only need to confirm that such regulation wouldn't cross property line. So we can deal with the property line issue.
Yeah.
And indeed, if we investigate this more and find that there's other language in the code that addresses the distance between buildings on the same lot, then we want to make sure we know what those are. So we can look into this one a little bit further.
Okay.
But also, I'd like to add, I think your point is well taken in that, we don't have a graphic here that shows a detached structure on the same lot for like a single-family house with a garage, a detached garage. So I think that what we should do is look at this graphic and redo it and put, at least in the single-family, this is for multifamily, I see, but
Right.
I guess theoretically you could have a detached garage on a multifamily, but we should show that very clearly, that there is a 6-foot minimum distance, because that's in a different section of the code, that detached garage distance or whatever it is. So we should be clear all in one place about what you can and can't do. So I think that's a point well taken. To your other point about as the density rises, you want setbacks between distances to be, or buildings to be bigger. That could create problems. I mean, if you have a high density neighborhood, there's an expectation that, you're going to have that density in that neighborhood. And if you make those setbacks too great, you kind of, take away
Defeat the
the
purpose of high
possibility
density,
of
yeah.
actually doing it. So I think that's, the intent is really to have setbacks between, on the side yards, be the setback between the buildings. That's the light and air, the privacy. And I think at upper stories, it even gets larger, right? And that's the intent, is to kind of, as the building gets taller, to step it away.
Yeah.
So I think we should stick with the setbacks, the side setbacks there, but I think you've got a real good point that we should be much more clear on the detached garage structure, particularly with the site plan here. And we don't show it on the single-family graphic either. So we should probably redo the graphic there as well.
Yeah, take a look at that and see, because, if you have buildings that are only 5 feet apart, that's not really leaving a whole lot of space for anything between those buildings. Also, see if there's any type of a fire code between the distance of the buildings, just from a perspective of the fire department, whether it needs to be further away for them to be able to get in between the buildings in case of a fire.
Okay. So that was page 42. I am looking now at 47, which, when we were talking earlier, nobody had anything on the clarification dimensions. Okay. Now on to 50, snap-in vinyl, double pane.
Is mullions, is that singular or plural? That's plural, right? Or is that a singular?
Mullions?
Are prohibited?
Hmm.
Sorry.
I believe we've all seen it plural, typically, yeah.
It's just- Okay. And then we should probably change it to are prohibited.
Right,
Oh, yeah.
are prohibited, thank you.
Okay. Does anybody have any additional?
Nope.
Okay. 51, corrective
It may be
reference.
a little bit difficult to see this one. It was for me when I first looked at this page, but at the top of the graphic, it refers to item number 5 when it really needs to refer to item number 8 on the
I see.
preceding page,
Okay.
transition areas. So it's just an erroneous reference in the graphic itself.
Okay. Page 65. Hold on. Which is just the removal of the senior citizen
Yeah,
residential
I didn't have
because it's
anything
covered
else.
in other areas.
Yeah.
Okay. Page 66, there's a couple different
Yeah.
there. Cinemas, anything that abuts a residential from a mixed use.
And I had a bunch of questions about that. I don't know if you want to go over those right now, or if we want to come back to that.
So you get a bunch. What's a bunch? 10?
3 or 4.
You just go over them then.
I just feel like we should just do it.
Okay. So I guess my question was, the things that are changed to conditional 17, give me an example of a small-scale recreation that is now going to be conditional use in say, the downtown. This to me looks like it discourages recreational use or recreation type things in our downtown. And I'm worried that, there's not enough things for the kids in our community to do. And if the parents are out having a dinner and want to do something like go to the wine bar afterwards, and the kids have nothing to do, and an opportunity arises for a small a small recreation use in the downtown that might complement other things, it's now gone from a minor use to a conditional use. And so it creates a disincentive to actually provide things for the kids in the community.
Is that the small scale or the
Yeah.
whole? Okay.
Yeah, and I can understand cinemas and theaters, but I was concerned about the sort of the small, an example of a small scale recreation and what that entails.
Yeah, what did you guys have in mind?
Well, the thinking behind this one had to do with, as you can see right now, under the code, it just allows a minor use permit, which would be reviewed by the zoning administrator. So because of the location where these would occur, staff felt it would be appropriate to increase the level of review to the Planning Commission. And this is not seen as being punitive by any means. It just elevates it to the Planning Commission rather than the zoning administrator. And where areas where these two mixed-use districts occurred in a situation that fronted onto an R district, we felt that the compatibility of a small-scale entertainment and recreation facility wouldn't be exactly compatible fronting onto an R district. So in those particular locations where it occurred, it would not be allowed.
Well,
Well, it would be allowed, but
under conditional.
it just wouldn't be permitted by right, or
See, that's kind of the confusing part, is that it's it's a conditional approval, but it's not allowed on things, on sites that front onto a residential district. And the other question I have is, if it fronts onto a residential district, but it's the backyard of somebody's house, does it still front to a residential district?
That's not how we're defining it. It needs to actually face to face.
Face to face?
Yes, it fronts
Okay.
onto, yeah.
'Cause that's not how I would read this. It fronts to a residential district. It doesn't matter what the residential district is. If it fronts to a residential district, then according to this, I would read it as it's not.
no.
No?
Well, I wouldn't, because we use other language, particularly when we've addressed stuff that abuts or that is adjacent to a residential district. So I guess I would see a front as something that directly faces it, but that doesn't mean my interpretation is right. That's just how I read it.
Yeah.
If you have a.
Yeah.
Because there are situations where
Fronting facing each other. basically.
residential,
Both needs to
it-
face. So
it-
actually, I think we could clean that up and clarify
So
that.
there are places where the front of a business district faces the back of somebody's house.
You mean like Walnut bordering Laurel?
I'm
or
thinking
so-
East San Carlos Avenue in
Oh,
particular.
Yeah, okay.
Okay.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
Where you could put something, you could now put a cinema there, okay, that faces somebody's backyard.
I
There are
don't,
no areas where mixed-use districts front onto a single-family zoning district, an RS3 or RS6, but they do have adjacency to the RM20 and I believe RM59 zoning districts. So areas, if we, again, I
Oh, so that's,
apologize.
okay, so that's not in MUN, okay, okay.
Yeah,
So going back to the small scale aspect of things, I guess my question is, why can't we give discretion to the, if I'm correct, I believe Al's the zoning administrator, isn't he?
It's actually the city manager.
The city manager is
Yeah.
the zoning, okay.
And so it's likely that the issue here is, as an example, 501 Walnut is a historic house, an old house. You might be familiar with it.
Yep.
If you make a right onto Holly Street, you'll see it. It's been on the market for quite some time.
Yes.
There was a lot of different uses that were proposed for that house. One of them was a bar or restaurant kind of thing. But similarly, if you had some kind of a recreational use where you might have a whole bunch of kids or, people dropping off, teenagers or something in the evenings, that does front onto other multiple family residential zone. So the issue there is, there are compatibility issues. There's, noise, parking, traffic, and those are the kind of things that we felt that the zoning administrator would most likely just kick up to the planning commission to give it a more of a public airing. And so why not just go that route anyway instead of making it a more rigorous and long, drawn-out process, go right to the commission, have the public hearing, and let people kind of address the issues in public more. So that was the thinking there. There you have it.
Okay.
Okay.
I think that sounds pretty logical.
Okay. The other thing that I was looking at, under convenience, MUN, so you've made that conditional, but then you've added condition 18, which says a minor use permit required for sites adjacent to residential districts. So I think you need to remove 18 there. If you're making it conditional, do you really want to make it a minor use permit for sites next to residential?
They don't sell alcohol at convenience markets, do they?
So
It
you've
could-
made
it
it
could be-
conditional,
it could be
and then
food
you've
and
said
beverage.
if it's
Right.
right next to a residential area, so I think you should remove 18.
Commissioner Marsters, I see where you're saying that it might be redundant because already a conditional use permit is required.
Yes.
So why, you're correct, that must be a typo there.
Okay, so we could strike out 18 then.
Is that 18, or should it
Well,
be?
it should be probably 10
or
and
should it be
18.
17?
I'm sorry, I'm not following.
I think it may be 17 and not 18.
Oh, I see. Okay, money use.
But
Right.
that's different, because that
Yeah,
wouldn't
that-
permit it. That's a little bit of a different
Right.
Yeah, that's what I'm.
situation. And the reason for that one is, like if up in Devonshire Canyon, you have the small market,
Right.
right? That's really almost like in the heart of a single-family residential neighborhood. Very compatible. People love it. They get the milk at in the evening or whatever they need. So it kind of works there.
Okay.
So that was the thinking of that. Now there could be issues if they apply for to sell beer and wine. Then that people might have more of an issue with it. But we just thought that it was like the neighborhood hub concept, where people might be more accepting if it was in their neighborhood. They'd use it. It's kind of a neighborhood market.
Then can we add the condition, I think, wasn't there a condition 16, which is the sale of alcoholic beverages is prohibited? So maybe it's 16 and not 18? Take a look at it, okay? It shouldn't be 18,
Yeah.
Yeah, 18 will definitely be removed.
okay? But 16 might be, especially if it's in a residential area, people might be more accepting if they aren't selling
Alcohol.
alcohol. Or maybe they will be accepting if it's.
Yeah.
Okay. Anything else on 66?
Not on that page.
Okay. 67? I didn't have anything. Did you guys have anything?
No, I think I was okay with that.
68. I see the changes. I didn't have any.
No.
Okay. 73.
So here's, change it from 2 to 4. And looking at multi-use neighborhood, that's an area that we tend to have a lot of conflicts with because they adjoin residential areas. And so in most cases, if I remember correctly, multi-use neighborhood has a density of 20 units per acre. And since I'm looking at that and thinking 20 units per acre, if you actually put 20 units per acre on there, you're probably not going to get more than 3 stories. And so I'm wondering why we're going from 2 to 4 instead of to 3.
Well, I guess I thought it was a correction of what we had actually.
I know.
Am I okay?
It is a correction, but I'm asking the question.
I see.
Okay, is let's think about this, because all of those, and the perfect example is the building along Laurel Street, where they came in and they wanted 4 stories, and we felt that it couldn't be more than 3 stories because
Single families.
it butts up against
Right.
single-family homes. And so my recommendation would be that we change that to 3 stories, okay, rather than 4 stories. And then it might make our job a little bit easier and your job a little bit easier when the developer comes in and says, I want to put 4 stories on all of these lots. If the height limit, if the limitation is 3 stories, it seems like that will solve a lot of the anger and frustration that the citizens have at suddenly finding that there's a 4-story building proposed for right next to their single-family home. Just a suggestion.
So just to clarify through the chair, are you saying only where these zones abut single-family residential?
MUNs, yes.
MUN.
Where they abut single-family residents.
Should be
And
within your book.
It sort of reflects, I think, what you guys are doing anyway. When they came in for a 4-story proposal along Laurel Street, my guess is that that was a tough thing to swallow. Well, let's actually make it part of our zoning ordinance so that you have a little bit more teeth behind what's actually happening.
You don't have it.
Think about it.
I guess,
We don't have to,
yeah,
we don't
my
have to
own-
answer that tonight.
Right, and my only question would be that we'd want to make sure that's consistent with the general plan. Then, since
Mm-hmm.
we're talking about something a little bigger.
And I think that the density is 20 units per acre, so that's reasonable for 20 units per acre. And there are no 4-story buildings in an MUN that I know of right now.
Commissioner Marsters, we can take a look at that. I know there are transitional standards built into the zoning ordinance under the MUN zoning district in terms of building step-back requirements based upon the distance from our districts. They vary. So we'd want to make sure that the language that's in the ordinance either A, already addresses this, or B, doesn't conflict with potential change. So on the online version of the city's website, it is 4. So there already is existing inconsistency. So inconsistency resulting in our interpretation that this was a mere correction. But if the commission desires, staff can certainly look into that as a whole.
I think it's worth looking into. Okay. 73. 76, just a step versus set.
Yep.
84, 2 inches.
Yeah.
The windows, yeah,
And
it wasn't
I-
feet.
it
Yeah,
wasn't
when,
feet, okay.
right. 86. Any, that's the wainscoting, that seemed fine. The new page 89. Anything? Nope. 90. 91.
The only question I had on 91 is what are 1 through 10? Because when I actually look at the zoning ordinance, they've got pluses and X's under numbers. Are those just the numbers that are actually supposed to be on the figure? Okay, so those aren't additional conditions. That was the concern I had, that they were
Corresponding to the figure.
new conditions, but they just correspond to the figure. Okay, great.
Okay. 95. I'm sorry. Is that a repeat?
It just shows up in another section of the ordinance,
forgive
so
me.
for consistency purposes, yeah.
Thank you. 100. 101.
The only question I had, I just wanted to make sure that pet daycare is still allowed under the kennels definition.
It is, and if you read the definition of kennels, it does reference pet, including pet daycare, so it is covered.
Yeah,
Great.
thank you.
102. 103.
The only question I had here is under freight and truck terminals and warehouses, and I have less of a problem with warehouses than I do with freight and truck terminals. Under the IH, some of those areas are directly adjacent to single-family homes, and so I wondered if we could parcel that out a little bit so that freight truck terminals could be prohibited within 500 feet of a residential district somehow. But the warehouses are fine, but I'm a little concerned with the nomenclature for freight truck terminals being right next to a single-family home. And so just take a look at that and see if there's a way we can adjust that.
Okay. Anything else on 103?
Nope.
104.
And on 104, again, the same thing I had is the issue of, so the numbers along the side actually represent the diagrams now. And then the concern, again, I had was a 75-foot building within, right next to a single-family home. And so is there some way to add that, make it 50 feet within 500 feet of a residential? Just something to think about.
You're looking maximum height.
I'm looking at maximum height for IH.
Industrial light.
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry. It
Or-
says 50. Or
No, it doesn't. Under IH, when you look at corner lots or, is
I'm
that
sorry. You're
width?
right. Yeah, I see what you mean.
I don't, maybe that's width.
Yeah, that's width.
Yeah.
Okay, so forget that.
Okay.
It is 50 feet. Okay.
Okay. 112.
Okay, so the question I had here, sorry, I have questions all over the place. The reverse vending machines are conditional, but the number 3 doesn't apply, which is not permitted when adjacent to a residential zoning district. And I wonder if we just forgot the number 3 on the reverse vending machine in a public location?
No, staff did not. We felt it was appropriate to have that particular use in a publicly zoned area. Reverse vending machines are simply facilities where you can put in your recyclable and receive cash immediately back. Whereas we wanted to regulate more the actual larger facility itself rather than a vending machine. So we didn't see the need to address just the vending machine in the public district.
And I don't know enough about them to know whether they make a lot of noise or not. And that would be my question with it. If it doesn't make a lot of noise, then I don't have a problem with it. But can we investigate whether the reverse make a lot of noise? And if they do, maybe we can address that somehow. I don't have a problem with it except for the noise.
We can look into that, Commissioner Marsters.
Okay.
113. Sorry, hold on. Okay. 114. 127. This is. Sorry, give me a second. Okay. 130. $131. Okay. That brings us to Exhibit C. Great. We're on to Article 3 now, and what looks like page 140. Tents. Did you have something on tents?
Well, I was just, I'm trying to understand what are we trying to get away from tents as a use for parking a car underneath? Or is this a tent in somebody's backyard? Is this a tent that's used in an industrial area to cover something that needs to stay out of the rain?
Like what's in Home Depot's parking lot?
What's the thing? What I'm trying to understand is what's the thinking behind taking tents out of this whole, or adding tents?
Commissioner Marsters and Planning Commissioners, we've seen cases where applicants are desiring to utilize tents as a permanent fixture on the site to address some certain need. What we'd like to see is, instead of something of a temporary nature like a tent, which can become weathered and have aesthetic issues over time, is to go ahead and construct a structure component to address their specific need. So if someone, so we don't want to treat them as an accessory building or structure, and there is some open area of interpretation in the zoning ordinance with respect to that. It doesn't mean that we don't allow tents, it's that we don't want to allow them or consider them to be an accessory structure. And if Jill and Gavin, you can chime in on any things that you might have come across with people trying to utilize tents in certain ways, feel free. But that's the idea. We can still allow tents in other examples that you've given. We allowed one at Shoreway Environmental. At the recycling, the wastewater treatment plant.
That's a good question. Any other questions on 140? Okay. 141. 142. 154. Sorry, give me a second. 159, 167, 174. It's like the redevelopment agency never existed. 175. 192, 200, 201. This is covering tree removals. 202, 207.
So I had a question there, and I just want to make sure that this is written in such a way that on any piece of property, the city has a right of way, a certain amount of feet into the property, okay, that they can actually, you don't own to the street, you own to the right of way, right? And the vast majority of the trees are in that city-owned right of way. And so I want to make sure that when you say any landscape being located within the boundaries of privately owned property, well, technically, most of the trees are in those rights of way, which are not privately owned. They're owned by the city, and the city has the right of way on those pieces of property. So the way you've written it, the city will now be responsible for the trees in all of those areas, is my reading of it. And so I just want to make sure that that's not your intent, and that maybe you need to look at the wording of that a little bit.
Staff, the wording that's presented here on page 207 under landscape maintenance, number 1 and number 2, the additional language, the proposed language, was taken directly from chapter 12 of the zoning ordinance that deals with streets and right-of-way and responsibilities for landscaping. So under private trees and landscaping, number 2, it's true that private trees and landscaping is, of course, any landscaping located within the boundaries of the privately owned property. But it goes further to say, and includes any landscaping that's abutting the private property, so that if there's a street tree in front of your home, it's not within your private property boundary, but because it's abutting your property on the street frontage, then the responsibility of the maintenance is the property owner, is the property owner's responsibility. So this language is taken verbatim from the other section of the city zoning ordinance. So we didn't want to change. We wanted to be consistent.
Okay. I just wanted to make,
the municipal code. I'm sorry.
I just wanted to make sure that there was
Chapter 12 of the municipal code.
Okay. Okay.
Okay. So that was 207. 213.
Can I back up for just a second?
Yes.
Can we go back to 200?
Sure.
And B1 says no protected tree shall be removed, pruned, or otherwise materially altered, but then it says trimming of a protected tree is allowed without such permit. Is the key word materially altered? Is that why it's not allowed, but then it is if it's just trimming?
If you could repeat the section, I kind of missed it.
Page 200, B1.
Right. It wasn't one of the changes, but it's a good question.
It's not actually, I'm sorry, it wasn't one of the changes, I just saw it there.
Okay, so the question is, can you
It
repeat?
says, no protected tree shall be removed, pruned, or otherwise materially altered without a permit. And then it says trimming of a protected tree is allowed without such permit. So is that just the exception to the above statement?
There's a definition for trimming, which is less than 30%, and a definition for pruning, which is more than 30%, and that's separated in the municipal code or in the zoning
Right.
ordinance. So
That clarifies it, thanks.
And we were just at 207. We're moving on to 213, and I know I have some questions. Does anybody else have some questions on 213?
Well, of course I do.
Well, go ahead, guys. I can wait till the end. Okay. Well, seeing as how this obviously seems to work with something we just came up with, I'm wondering if number 2 in particular, under D, I guess whether it should be stricken or reconsidered. The reason being is that we had gone through many discussions on what was considered 3 feet during the issue that we had before us just a few weeks ago. So I'm wondering if we should change or alter that. Because to me, every time I read it, it says, under no circumstances will a setback of less than 3 feet be considered, even if it's a pre-existing non-conforming.
Which is, needs to be clarified.
Yeah, that's a point of clarification. Although for the issue of nonconforming setbacks, for this particular section talks about additions. So when you're adding 2, so just to...
I see.
Just, right, because you recall for the issue that we were dealing with was something that was pre-existing, so
Right.
rather than being added to. But again, that's a good point to bring up as we look at the overall language under this section, which is something that we were hoping to do. And previously, under my presentation, I mentioned there's different ways that cities will address the allowance for additions on non-conforming setback areas. And the language here is a starting place for our discussion, which tries to keep with what the city was previously allowing as some form of continuation, but under certain circumstances. And one of the items that we felt was problematic was retaining 50% of the roof. The other area that was problematic, simply because it wasn't written down, is how we interpreted the 15% material criteria. So we wanted to do 2 things, is remove reference to the roof, and number 2, define in writing how we are interpreting the 50% requirement. But we are open to hearing your comments with respect to do we want to continue allowing flexibility? Do we want all additions to come in regardless to conform to our code, regardless if there's a pre-existing non-conforming setback? So say, for example, you have a 3-foot setback. If someone wanted to come in and do an addition to that area,
Right.
They would be required to indent that wall by 2 additional feet.
Right.
And maybe that's okay for small additions, but do we want to allow it for a very large addition to extend the 3-foot setback?
And I'm thinking, just using the garage example, if somebody put an addition on the back of a garage or was or that was a part of the housing structure, if they would have to go back an additional 2 feet, I don't know that we would want to be so rigid, but that's up to you guys.
Yeah, and the other question that I'm wondering about here is the 50% of the exterior wall. And so when I look at that and it said the wall is really everything from the studs out, okay? And I thought, well, if they're going to add something up above it, and you're only allowed to remove half of it, wouldn't it be better to actually keep the studs and remove the exterior portion as the 50%, considering the studs being the other 50% that stays, and then allowing them to match the siding along the entire side of the house, rather than only on 50% of the house? So that's another. Does that make sense?
Did it make sense to you? Okay. Maybe you could repeat it, but before you repeat it, I'll just jump in here. If we didn't use wording that was entirely clear, we can definitely take a look at this. But the intent is, when we define, our intent is to define what we mean by 50%.
The language here is intended to say 50% means you can remove the outside sheeting, the sheetrock and the siding, but you can keep the actual frame, the actual studs. We want you to keep the framing and the studs, but you can remove the sheetrock and siding. So if that's not exactly clear, we can correct that.
Yeah, because it sounded to me like you had to keep the studs, and then you could only remove 50% of the rest of the stuff.
Okay, so we'll clarify that. Yeah, so your concern was 50% of the rest of the stuff?
Yes.
Which is not, okay.
Which is not what you're talking about, which, then, yeah.
So I'm not clear, okay, so basically the framing is the 50%. You have to keep 50% of the framing, but the exterior side, the sheetrock is not considered part of that 50% at all. Okay.
That's correct. So 50% would mean the framing. The framing needs to be retained.
Okay.
And you can remove
100%
the
of
siding.
the framing?
Yeah, that's
50%
what
of the
the-
framing,
that's what I'm getting
or
at.
is
So-
the framing the 50%? Do you understand? You know what I'm saying?
50% of the framing, I think, is what.
It's the length of the wall. So like, let's say you have a 30-foot long wall. The idea is you'd keep 15 feet, right? Isn't that right? Like, let's say you have a 30-foot long setback, right, and your wall, 30 feet. If you cut it back to 15, that's 50% of the length of that wall. So that's how historically we've done it.
Okay.
So I read that to mean that, like Angela was saying, I think, the 50% is the studs. So
Yeah,
all the
that's
studs
right.
have to stay.
That's
and
correct.
The other
yeah.
50% is the sheetrock, and all of that is removed.
Just
doesn't have
material.
No, I mean, in it's a policy. It's sort of it's not written anywhere.
Okay.
It's been a historic policy of the city, and what you'll see with additions all over town is you'll see one like stud wall standing, and you'll go, "Why is that stud wall there?" But that's the reason. So basically, historically, we've allowed everything to be removed except for the wood, interior structure of the wood, and that constitutes the wall, the 50%, and that's how we've done it. So we could clarify that you can remove all the exterior material and just leave the wood part up.
Right. I guess the
it's
question
still
we're still trying to get at is of that stud wall, that studs that are left, can 50% of them be removed, or do all of them have to stay?
50% of the actual stud wall can be removed. So like I was saying earlier, if you have a 30-foot stud wall length, am I going the right direction?
No,
on
you
this?
are, and I think we're I guess under both situations we could consider. It sounds like there's two different scenarios. You have
Right.
one wall of one length, and removing 50% could mean that you're only leaving the framing, same dimension. Removing 50% under the scenario that Alva's just talking about means you could remove half of the wall.
Right.
So those are two different scenarios. Well, those are two different scenarios that could be incorporated within this section of the ordinance. Okay, so that's what we're trying to clarify, because I think what in practice it's been done both ways.
Yeah.
Is what I'm hearing.
Okay.
So then moving on to what would be number 4, I guess the question then would be, if a situation arose like what was similar to what was brought before us, even if it was an addition and not a garage, and the safety of the studs and the underlying foundation was determined by building to be not sound, would that trigger a removal, a pushback of the setbacks, or would that trigger more review where we can allow the current setback?
I
Or the
discussed this
grandfathered.
section with the city attorney, and I don't know if he had a chance to talk with you about this as well, but he was feeling that it's probably better to leave this number 4, just remove it, because we don't want to be in a situation where a project may be under construction, and along the way, due to unforeseen circumstances, the contractor thinks something needs to come out, the building inspector goes out there, they believe it needs to come out, and we don't want to hold a project up
and saying, well, now you need to redesign because we're going to require our code. So in for those particular reasons, in that scenario, we don't want to have this language. I think what we can do, what our goal was in putting item number 4 in here and clarifying that, hey, if you remove it, you need to build it back, is we want applicants and property owners to be on notice that when we're allowing them to build and add an addition onto a property with a nonconforming setback, we are allowing them some flexibility with respect to the language we have in our code that allows an addition for a nonconforming setback. And we want to put them that on notice that if there's going to be some major removal that, the standards that are in place otherwise might be required. One of the ways that we can accomplish that is making it clear in the conditions of approval what we're approving, because when we approve a project, we're approving the design review of the project as a whole. It's
Right.
not one part of it or piece of it. So if you approve it as a whole already and something happens along the way to a non-conforming section, then why would we require them to redesign? And it could, cost a lot of money and time and expense trying to reconfigure the property after it's already been approved as a whole. So we could probably do without that language and address it either in very clear conditions of approval, or we could bump projects to a higher level of review, such as the RDRC, where there's nonconformities, where nonconformities are part of the project, so that they get clear instructions that we, the city, are going to allow you to do an addition even with a nonconforming setback, and give some assurance that if something were to happen, then the overall design can remain as approved and be constructed as approved.
So then,
That makes
based on what you just said, we would remove what is currently underlined and in red on page number 4 on page 213.
Or is that?
That looks like it's actually a removal.
Well, we would be removing our proposal.
Okay.
So number 4 is what we had proposed, but after further consideration and discussion with the city attorney, we think we should remove it. So
That's what I thought.
in
Okay.
effect, we're retracting our proposal for number 4.
And going back to the stud issue, I really think this should be more clearly described, because the way it sounds to me like you're saying that the 50% of the materials can be removed, but not the 50% of the length of the wall or whatever can be removed. That's what it sounds like to me when I read it.
We can come back with some language to clarify that.
Okay.
Going back, Madam Chair, to number 2, about you kind of touched on it a little bit, the
3 feet.
3-foot setback, and the way that I've always read this is, even if you have 1 foot, we're saying on one hand, if you have a 1-foot setback, well, it kind of looks at first like, oh, the city's going to let me have that if I do the 50% thing, but then the next sentence says, nope. If it's 1 foot away, forget it. You got to move it at least 3 feet in every circumstance. That's the way, and that's some of the discussions that we had with the city attorney during that last issue that you referred to earlier. So this, I think we need to have a little more discussion around that. And I think the idea is, if you did have, let's say you had a 1-foot setback. Let's say you had it on both sides of the house, and then you were going to rebuild the house like that. Is that okay?
Right.
And there may be issues of, and we haven't really explored this, but from a fire safety standpoint, I think the 3 feet is really intended to allow for, access to the rear or to the front. If you get in a fire, if you had to go out the back of your house or something and you wanted to get out to the street, and you may not be able to do it.
Right.
Right? Or vice versa, if a fireman had to get through, they'd have to go through the house as opposed to the side of the house. So I think that's the intent of this whole 3-foot thing it's more of a safety access, and it could be a light and air kind of thing too, but I think more importantly it's public safety.
So then we could talk about this more.
Yeah.
I guess particularly because the language confuses me a bit. If it's an existing setback, what we'd do about it exactly.
And Madam Chair and Commissioners, we're certainly open to any comments you may have or even observations that you think that should be considered in this particular section of the zoning ordinance.
So that's what I was going to suggest here. One of the questions I have is, anytime there's a non-conforming piece of the property, does the city ever go out and inspect that as part of the application process? So, for example, if the city if it were part of the requirements for a non-conforming project, to have one of the city inspectors go out and take a look at it to make certain that there isn't going to be any issues. So if an inspector had gone out to the one that we looked at, he would have looked at that and went, well, there's no way the studs are falling apart, and there's no way you're going to be able to save 50% of this. That would have changed the entire process along the way. So I'm wondering if there's a requirement for things that are non-conforming. And I don't know how many are non-conforming or whether that's a burden on the city, but it just may be a suggestion to solve some of these issues.
In like when they apply?
When they make as part of the
Oh,
application.
interesting. I guess my concern would be is particularly for the studs. I don't think you'd know that until you ripped the wall, until you took off most of the information. But I'm not in construction.
Most of these garages don't have interior walls if they're that old. And so you might be able to see some of that, or you might be able to look at the foundation. I don't know, it's just a suggestion.
Yeah, and certainly that's a conversation that we had as well internally with other staff. That's a procedural addition we could include if the city felt, we really want to get ahead of these, if it's worthwhile to kind of do some sort of pre-inspection to kind of get an assessment of, hey, is this wall really going to stay, or is it going to end up, do we see it, any risk for it coming down? And if so, maybe we ought to require something different for this project at the outset.
So it would be more of a procedural thing than a code thing? Okay.
Right.
Okay, great. Anything else for 213?
No, you brought up every point that I was going to
Okay. 220. That's unbundled parking. 224. 237. I had something quick. Did anybody else have anything?
Oh, she added 229 too, right?
Um,
That was the
it's the
addition.
tandem parking.
Yeah, so that was
Okay.
Oh, it's the extra page that we got.
Yeah, it was the extra page that we got.
229.
director with off-site parking facilities.
Oh, sorry, I skipped 229. Did you guys have anything on 229?
No.
Before I move on, thank you for that catch. Okay, now 237. Anybody have any questions on that? I just had a quick clarification. So for F, this would be allowing a tandem garage or carport, but we're also indicating this 10 by 40 is what would be standard for a tandem garage. Am I correct? Is that what we're doing?
That's correct. So there'd be two options. If you want to build a garage, you can do a standard, which is, two cars side by side, 20 by 20, or you can do a two-car tandem garage. The code allows tandem parking, but it was silent. It only had one formula for a parking garage. So we wanted to allow a tandem garage consistent with the allowance for tandem parking in general.
Okay,
Why
I understand.
wouldn't-
Thank you.
So why wouldn't you put that as an option under B instead of instead of making it a separate line, you give them the option under B?
We could do that.
Yeah, actually, I think that
Well,
makes
it makes a
sense.
little
That sort of connects them so that you have one or the other instead of two separate items.
That's a good suggestion. Thank you.
That was 237. Now I'm on to 251, 270, 285. Let's drop in plastic signs. 289.
So actually, can we go back to that one real quick?
Yep. 285.
Yeah, 285, drop in plastic signs. So I know there's a lot of, this is in reference to changing signage, basically, and replacing it with kind of like for like, that which is currently going on, or I'm a little confused about that one, what it's referencing.
So you mean
So-
what?
Did
what-
you need
Drop in plastic
clarification?
signs.
Yes.
Well, with plastic signs, what you'll see sometimes is like a box,
Light
and then
box.
they'll take a piece of plexiglass and they'll just put like tape lettering on it.
Uh-huh.
And what happens over time is it really starts to deteriorate and it changes color and it looks bad and the lettering starts to fall off. And so we're asking for a little nicer signage. And this happens more for, of course, it's a commercial business issue. And it looks better if you have either cutout lettering or something that punches through a backing material. So it's an aesthetic issue, and so it's an upgrade, and we'd like our downtown and our commercial businesses to use a little bit better signage.
Any other questions on 285? Okay. 289, accessory uses. Okay. 294, 295, 297. This is the beginning of the conversation around cottage food operations. And that also includes page 289.
So can you bring us back some potential wording for limiting the distance between these operations, similar to limiting the distance between, say, second units or daycares, or I don't know if daycares are limited in distance. No. Okay. So maybe like second units or something along that line, just so we don't, again, have sort of an over-concentration of, and maybe only in the only under the condition where they're selling out of their house, okay, and not if they're just producing it there and taking it somewhere else, or if they have more than one employee. Is that the other condition?
They can have the equivalent of one full-time employee. That's what the state allows for. So they cannot have more
can't
than
have more.
one
Okay.
full-time employee. I mean, I guess they could have two part-time, but they're only there one at a time. So it's the equivalent of one full-time employee.
That may need to be clarified also, because
Yeah,
you could have
I can see two
two
part-timers
or
there at the
three
same
or four
time.
part-time people there all at the same time and only work 2 hours.
Yeah, the idea is that they're, right, so we can, yeah,
So-
I think the intent of the state is there would only be one additional employee there
Okay.
at a time, but it doesn't mean only one. You could have
Then I-
two
then I-
part-time or
You can
like a
have two
scenario.
people there
you
20
just
hours a week
suggested.
for the same days instead of one person for 40 hours.
So I would recommend limiting the distance between them if they're actually selling outside, selling out of the home. Okay, because you're going to have the same parking issues you have with second units.
But this-
Why don't you make it a
Well,
parking requirement then, as opposed to trying to figure out if they're selling it out of the home or not? Kind of eliminates.
Because I don't know if you can require somebody to have an additional parking spot simply
They're
for.
running a business, so kind of triggers another,
Yeah,
that's
but
what
you're
that was
running-
a suggestion that she actually had made.
Oh, okay.
Well,
Let's
get
see what she can come
clarification
back
on what-
with. Yeah.
On what Lisa's suggestion
Yeah.
was. 'Cause that's a good point.
Instead of instead of just limiting it to the distance, let's see what alternatives you can come up with to address that, because it sounded like there were other ways of addressing it other than just limiting the distance.
Sure, and I think what it sounds like from the commission is that commission's also interested in understanding what regulations can be put in place with respect to parking for customers who may want to come and purchase out of the home,
Yeah.
as well as perhaps parking for that additional employee.
Yeah,
Okay.
that sounds great.
Perfect.
But we're saying here that without direct sales on site are prohibited by right. So as long as, if they're not doing, but the direct sales, they would have to get the
Minor
minor
use
use permit?
That's correct.
Okay.
That's our first step at creating regulations for this. So if you're a cottage food operator and you're not, someone may choose, they don't want people to come to their home, or they don't
Right.
need an outside employee. If they're operating under those scenarios, what staff is recommending that they just be permitted by right, just like a home occupation. It's
Right.
only when you have an outside employer, only when you're doing those additional, or when you want to have to sell out of your home, that we would look at
Okay.
some operating regulations
I would agree with that.
Commissioner Marsters was suggesting.
Okay.
Great. Okay, so that takes us through to 298 and 300. 301 also. 302.
I got all kinds of.
Now,
This is one of my pet peeves.
okay, now just to be clear, right, so we're talking about D2, the minimum clearance?
Yes.
302? Okay.
But it sort of goes beyond that.
Sure.
Okay, because we sort of need to start enforcing a lot of these things. I walk past Starbucks and there's 3 or 4 umbrellas in the middle of the walkway that are low enough that people are hitting their heads on all the time. You walk a little bit further down the street and the next restaurant is actually storing their furniture in the alleyway every night. Okay? The next one down has got tables that are so far out, and when they sit at them, that you have to go out into the street in order to get around the tables. So I see you're reducing it from 6 feet to 4 feet. My suggestion would be if we enforce this, then there's nothing wrong with 6 feet. The sidewalks were widened so that people could easily walk down the sidewalks in the downtown. That was part of the whole downtown improvement district. And what we've done is by putting the tables out there, granted, I think it's a great idea to have tables out there, but we still need to have enough space for people to walk by. And I'm not sure that 4 feet is enough space to be able to get by. And I think we need to have some discussion about this whole piece here. Maybe it's 5 feet, maybe it's not 6 feet, but I think.
Or maybe
there
it's
are-
4 feet vigorously enforced versus 6 feet of.
Yeah, maybe
Whatever.
it's 4 feet with nobody allowed to have their chair on the outside edge of the table so that they can't back up into that 4 feet as soon as the inspector goes by. Those are some of the issues that we have here. At 4 feet, you can't get pedestrians going in either direction. You end up with one person going, the next person going.
And you're
You
walking
end
dogs
up,
and-
you've got dogs, you've got people with strollers, you've got handicapped individuals who can't get through there if other people are walking. I've looked online at the minimum distance for an individual who happens to be in a wheelchair. They need almost that whole 4 feet in order to get through. Or they need more than 3 feet. And so that doesn't leave an opportunity for anybody to go in the other direction. So I think that this is a chapter that we really need to think about. And I understand from the business's perspective that this is something that really they want, but I think that they were given an inch to get the tables out there, and in a lot of cases, they've really taken over the sidewalks. And so I think we need to address this somehow.
I'm going to give staff just a chance to comment on it, but I agree. I think this is something that can be talked about more. Did you guys want to comment quickly? I think we can talk about this more, though.
Certainly. I can let you know the process that staff went through in proposing this recommendation. It's true. I mean, there are issues with code enforcement in the downtown with respect to storing things on the sidewalk, et cetera. We are aware of that, and so I can definitely appreciate your comments on that. Planning staff met with the building official and staff from Public Works. There are a number of folks at the table, and we were talking about the necessary width that people need in order to be able to pass. And it came up that our current ordinance requires 6, because, like you said, it's a matter of code enforcement, what's actually occurring on the ground. And in fact, what we found is that many of the outdoor dining and retail establishments that have, some of their operations on the sidewalk in the public right-of-way would never be able to meet the 6-foot requirement. So based upon that realization, staff discussed an alternative, and through the building official and Public Works staff together, they felt that 4 feet was the right distance. I mean, I'd have to confirm with the building official if 4 feet is coming from a certain code requirement, but they were satisfied and felt that that was something that could be implemented and still allow for passage, while still allowing those businesses to maintain, and retail and restaurant businesses to maintain sidewalk seating. So we have a situation where obviously there's a limited amount of sidewalk space, right-of-way space. Our downtown is configured the way that it is unless we change it. So right now, what would be the best solution to allow those businesses to continue to have their presence while having a reasonable or minimum amount of distance for passerbys? So maybe it's something more to the tune of what you mentioned, Chair Pedersen, where you have the 4, but it's really enforced.
And if I could add to that, I think that it's an important conversation that you're having. I mean, everybody that uses the downtown, we all see this. We do enforce things, but, our staff isn't down there all the time, and so, and we also don't typically have code enforcement on the weekends, so sometimes things get worse on the weekends because they know that we don't have the staff. But it's an important discussion to have, and I think that if you're concerned with it, while it may work from an ADA standpoint, and it might work for people actually getting through, your concern is it's important to let the city council know of your concern. We work very closely with the chamber, with the businesses in the community, and we're in charge of code enforcement. So there's sort of a fine line, with regard to enforcement and how strict you are about these things. But it's if the conversation rises to the next level a little bit, and you bring it up as something you're concerned about as a commission, we put it in the staff report. Then it's something that we can bring to the business community and say, there is, some broader concern here about your practices. And again, we do talk to these folks, and I've actually moved umbrellas or asked them to move umbrellas myself. So it's not, we're all in this together. So that's what I would suggest. If you really are concerned, I think this is a real good opportunity to bring it up. We put it in the staff report, and we have this conversation on a broader level with the council too, and let the chamber know that this is something that's a real issue for folks.
Yeah, I think there is a solution to this. And it may be that we go to 4 feet, and it may be that we just don't allow chairs that could potentially go into the 4 feet, okay? And the
Darn umbrellas.
or the umbrellas, or you know, it may also involve moving some existing signs that actually sit in the sidewalk, because that's going to be a big issue, because a lot of those signs are directly across from the tables. There's no way you're ever going to get 4 feet for some of these tables unless we potentially move those signs to locations where they're not impacting the pedestrian pathway. I think another thing, I've seen restaurants, they've put up walls, and I have less of a problem with the wall than I do with the fact that they stick their excess furniture on the other side of the wall in front of the next business, and that begins to look a little bit trashy, okay? And that's not really what we want in our downtown.
Well, I think exactly. I think then we should go ahead and raise that as a concern that we would like to discuss further as per Al's suggestion. Okay. All right. So we will move on. 307 also includes the same conversation. So 308. I'm sorry. Give me a second. Is outdoor storage. Okay. Any conversation on that? 314. Second unit dwellings. 316. 317. 322. 331. And now we are on to Exhibit D. 426.
So the question I had under large, so the small home facility talks about up to 6 children, but that also includes any children. Is it 6 children or up to 8 children?
I'm sorry, which number one?
C1, and C2.
So is it 6 children and then 8 if they meet the criteria of section 102? Okay.
So staff was trying to accomplish not repeating the full section of child care home licensing requirements under Title II of the code, the state code. So the reason why the state is pointing out 2 different maximum number of children regulations has to do with the age. So if the children are infants, for example, then that is calculated differently than if they're all if they're not infants and if they're of different ages. And it also includes whether or not the home has a child, I believe, under the age of 10. And all of this is spelled out really clearly under California law with respect to family child care facilities at the home. So if the commission feels we really ought to spell out the entire section, and it is rather long because there's very many scenarios, we could consider that, but I would suggest that we just refer to the section of the code because sometimes it changes. And I think at least providing some sort of parameters in terms of the number of what it really means to be a small family child care facility. You're either going to have up to 6 or you might have 8 depending upon the ages. And the same with large. You could have, up to 12 or sometimes up to 14, again, depending upon the ages of children that are being cared for. So that's why there's a range in there.
That makes sense,
Okay.
and I think referring to it is the best way to go. Okay. 438. 451. 452. 459. 460. And then that brings us to Attachment 2, Title 3, Revenue and Finance, the Parking Exception Fund, which, page 1. Now, Lisa, just to be clear, this is this where you wanted our comments?
Yes, staff wanted to inform the commission as a courtesy that there is a section in the municipal code, Title 3, Revenue and Finance, that addresses the parking exception fund. This is a funding mechanism that was set up some years ago with respect to parking in lieu fees. So it has some language in here in terms of where it could be collected from and where it needed to be used. And it referenced the West Side specific plan, but that plan no longer exists. So we're proposing some modifications to Title III of the Municipal Code to the council. And the reason why we wanted to inform the commission that we're doing this is because this is indirectly related to the parking in lieu fee section of the zoning ordinance. So as you can see on pages 2 and 3, there's no changes being proposed to the current language we have in our ordinance with respect to in lieu fee parking, where you can do it and what the fees should be used for, et cetera. So we're just proposing to amend Title III to catch up with the regulations that we most currently set in place under the zoning ordinance. So if you were to look at both of these in concert, there would be inconsistency on, what the funds could be used for example.
Okay.
So if the commission has any comments or anything that they might feel that they would like to have staff reflect to the city council, we can certainly forward those on. But if there's none, that's fine too.
Does anybody have any questions about this section, page 1, 2, or 3, or any comments to forward on to council? Yeah, I don't either. Nope.
I do have one more issue now that you've finished that I would like to bring up and see if we can address at this time. Is there any attempt to fix sort of the parking requirements for outdoor seating for restaurants?
Clarify what you mean by that.
I'm thinking of the situation that is occurring down on the south side, the south end of Laurel, where a business came along and put in and was required to put in parking based on their seating inside the restaurant, but then seating was developed outside of a restaurant, and that has created all kinds of additional parking impacts that were never taken into consideration when the business was approved in the first place. And so my question is, are we going to address that as part of parking requirements for businesses that have additional seating outside?
I guess that makes a lot of sense, and I guess my question would be then procedurally, what do we do if a business is adding additional seating outside? My assumption would always be that it would revisit a calculation of some sort as far as occupancy, but it doesn't do that, does it?
Currently, our ordinance has parking requirements for the space inside. It does not address outdoor seating areas, and
even if it's in like a permanent structure, say like the office versus the sidewalk on Laurel?
I'd have to check and see what the office went through because I don't know if that went through a conditional use permit process, but we don't have parking regulations for outdoor seating. Outdoor seating is a use that may not always be in operation. There are seasonal conditions preventing folks from sitting outside or maybe not wanting to sit outside, or it could be an area that's, not considered permanent in every certain scenario. where an operator may decide they want some outdoor seating and for some reason decide to change it. So I think because of the fluidity of the particular use, there aren't any parking requirements. And typically, this is in the mixed-use district. These occur in the mixed-use districts, not in all outdoor seating locations, of course, but for the most part. So I knew that the city went through a process to reduce parking requirements in the mixed-use district simply because of the character of the downtown. It's a walkable setting, close to transit, et cetera. And certainly the more parking that you provide, you begin to lose the density and character that's found in downtown settings. You tend to wind up with gaps in the downtown where parking is now provided, where otherwise building or plazas or other structural components might have been in place.
Except that
But I think,
occasionally,
through the chair, I think you've got a good point, that you're seeing something with a business that was unanticipated. So it was an unanticipated consequence, and also, at some point, the outdoor space becomes more like an indoor space, right? I mean,
Hence.
and if there's a significant amount of seating added beyond, something that you would expect from downtown,
Right.
then you do, and you do see real differences in impact and people visiting over there. So that, I think you're on to something there. And maybe it's a parking ratio, maybe it's just level of review about, well, if you can't provide the parking on site, but you want to do this, you're going to have to come up with some other solution, maybe off-site. Maybe the commission would consider an off-site solution, So maybe it's a higher level of review if you want to go over a certain threshold.
Yeah.
So I think that it's something that we will need to come back to the commission with and take a look at it, but I think it's probably something we need to look at.
I'm looking for alternatives, some way that we can prevent this type of problem from happening again,
Yeah.
because it impacts all of the surrounding businesses to a great degree. And in some cases, one business can take up all the available parking that's left, and that will prevent additional projects from coming in. And so that's what I'm looking to avoid.
So we'll come back with some ideas for you.
Great.
One making note about that, but there's the tent references. There's two different places. I'm just really concerned that it might be interpreted as meaning someone's backyard tent. Is there any way that we can spell it out that that's not the intention?
Yeah, I think we could be clear that you can camp overnight or for a couple of nights in your
Yeah, you can
yard
have
if
your
you
kid out
want
with
to.
us. Yeah.
I think we could probably look at that. I mean, but the intent was to prevent your neighbor from putting up a tent that would just stay there
Right.
for 10 years and just,
Yeah.
We'd rather them build a pergola.
Right, well, something nice, yeah.
Right. Okay.
And it's true. There are cases where people just have a lot of stuff, and they've come to the city and said, I'd like to put up a tent in my backyard because I want to store stuff, and they run out of room in the garage or whatever. And that's something that we don't want to allow. But certainly, if folks want to have a slumber party and
Junior
put up a
wants to
tent
have
overnight
boys
with
over for
kids, that's
campfire. Okay.
Great. Well, thank you, everybody, for going through that. I think we've given a lot of direction for the next meeting, at which point we can get more information and make our recommendations beyond what we've already talked about. So that is the end of item B, and we'll go ahead and move on to reports, correspondence, and general information. Item A, report on recent city council actions.
I have none to report.
10:30. Item B, planning commission comments or reports. Anybody? No. I do have one. I will be out of the country from the 13th through the 26th of April. So don't do anything fun while I'm gone.
I will be out of the country from the 26th of April to May 7th.
Okay, hearing nothing else, correspondence. Beyond what was on the dais, Lisa, for me?
There's no further correspondence beyond that was on the dais. Thank you.
Okay. And then finally, item D, planning staff comments, reports, and updates of current projects.
Yes, I think we're still on track to bring forward at the next Planning Commission hearing, which is now April the 7th, potentially the application by Cal Water for 2 new water storage tanks. There is a community meeting occurring this week at the City Library at 6 o'clock p.m., whereby Cal Water will be available to answer questions about their project. So essentially what they're doing is their community outreach, but because they don't have a venue for it, we're allowing them to use the library room facility. They're inviting the public, so staff will be available as well.
What day?
It's this Wednesday, which is the 19th at 6 o'clock p.m.,
Thank you.
second floor library. Cal Water will be presenting their project, what the proposal includes, and answer any questions the community might have. So we may be on target to bring that to the commission on April 7th. We also have a new mixed-use building coming in at 1673 Laurel Street, and it looks like they are pretty close to being ready for April 7th. We just need to check in with them and make sure they've got all of their plans ready to go and everything's consistent and accurately depicted on those plans for your review. And then an item that will be coming forward to the Planning Commission in the near future is a general plan conformity determination for the city's capital improvement program. And that's something that we've done in the past. I think the last time it was brought to the Planning Commission was in 2012 for the 2-year CIP cycle. So that's something that we will be bringing to you for your determination and recommendation to the City Council. And I believe that's it in terms of upcoming items.
Thank you very much. With that, we are adjourned at what looks like 10:08.